Hello everyone. Welcome back to Mr. Darkvale. Tonight we're covering 15 of the most disturbing true trucking stories ever shared with this channel, all from one stretch of Arizona highway. These came from solo drivers, team drivers, and dispatchers who've worked I-40 for years. And this isn't exaggerated folklore. The details are too precise, too repeated, too disturbing to be coincidence. We cross-checked what we could, and the details line up with dispatch records, police reports, and warnings drivers still trade with each other over the CB. Tonight, a scale inspector nobody at that station has ever heard of. A rig that mirrors another truck's every move for 60 miles, never falling back. A radio transmission that cuts off mid-sentence over the Colorado River, and a cab found empty on the other side. Subscribe and turn that bell on, because this channel is built on grounded, slow-building dread over quick shock tactics. If you've driven this stretch and something's happened to you, tell us in the comments. What happened to you might be next on this channel. Now cut your dome light and get ready. I'd been on the road since 4 that morning, Albuquerque to Phoenix, with a reefer trailer full of produce that had to hit the dock by 6, and by the time I crossed into Arizona, the sky behind me was just a thin orange line over the mesas, and everything ahead was black. The port of entry at Lupton sits right where the interstate dips down from the New Mexico line, and I'd rolled through it maybe 200 times over the years. You slow down, you watch for the sign, you roll onto the scale, and a guy in a vest either waves you through or pulls you in for a look at your logbook. Routine. The kind of thing you stop thinking about after your first year driving. That night, the lights were on, same as always. That flashing message board saying open, inspection ahead, and I eased off the throttle and lined up for the scale the way I'd done 1,000 times. A man stepped out from the shadow of the building before I even got close to the ramp, waving his arms, and at first I figured he was redirecting me to a different lane. Instead, he pointed past the scale entirely, out toward a gravel lot on the far side that I'd never once seen a truck parked in, dark except for what little bounced off my own headlights. He shouted something about a full inspection and waved me on. I remember sitting there a second with my foot on the brake, thinking that's not how this works, you weigh first. But it was 2 in the morning, and I was tired, and he had a vest on, with reflective stripes and some kind of patch on the chest. So I did what you do when a man with a badge tells you to pull over. I pulled over. He came around to my door, slow, unhurried, the kind of walk you'd expect from somebody who'd done this 10,000 times, and he asked for my logbook and my bills of lading, which was normal enough. But then the questions started drifting somewhere else. He asked if I was running this route alone. I said yeah, always have. He asked if anybody was expecting me before morning, whether my dispatcher would notice if I ran a little behind, whether my family knew exactly where I was tonight, or just the general direction. I laughed it off the first time, told him my wife tracks my truck on an app, ha, and he just nodded slow, like that was useful information, rather than small talk. No real inspector has ever asked me if my wife knows where I am. They ask about axle weights. They ask about my medical card. They do not care one bit whether anyone on this earth is expecting me anywhere. I started paying closer attention to him after that, the way you do when some part of your gut has already decided something's wrong before your head catches up. His vest was faded in a way that didn't match the brightness of the reflective tape, like it had been through a lot more sun than the tape had. The patch on the chest said something close to Arizona Department of Transportation, but the wording was off. Some extra word in there that didn't belong, and when I asked to see his ID, he patted his pockets and said it was back in the booth. He'd grab it after he finished up with me. No handheld scanner, no radio on his hip crackling with the other guys inside. Just him, alone, in a gravel lot, with no other trucks and no lit-up booth anywhere behind him that I could see. I told him I needed to grab my logbook, the paper one, said the electronic thing was acting up. Bought myself a reason to climb back into my cab and shut the door for a second. Sitting up there with the door locked, hands actually shaking a little, I looked in my mirror to check where he was standing, and he wasn't where I'd left him. He'd moved off to the side, out past the throw of my headlights, and I lost him in the dark for a second, which is when another set of headlights swung hard off the interstate and into that gravel lot, blue and red light bar dark, but unmistakably a trooper's SUV. I about could have cried with relief. I got out to flag him down, and by the time he'd parked and stepped out, the man in the vest was gone. Not walked off, not ducked around the building, just gone. And there was nowhere in that lot for a person to disappear to in 4 or 5 seconds. The trooper walked the gravel with his flashlight, and there weren't any fresh footprints besides mine and his own. No tire tracks that didn't belong to my rig, and when he checked the booth by the scale, it was locked up dark. Generator off, because as it turned out, the whole station had been closed since 9 that night. Short-staffed, same as it had been 3 nights a week for the past month, according to him. The open sign, flashing on the highway, had been left running on its own timer, something the state hadn't gotten around to fixing, meaning nobody official had been out there waving trucks off the scale at all, meaning whoever that was had been standing in an unlit lot at a closed station, dressed to look like he belonged there, in a spot he had to have known would be empty. The trooper filed a report, and I gave him every detail I could remember: the vest, the patch, the way the man talked, and for a couple weeks I figured that was the end of it. One bad, strange night, on a stretch of highway, I'd have to keep driving whether I liked it or not. Then I got a call from an investigator with the state, and the story got a lot bigger than one weird guy in a vest. There'd never been an employee matching that description assigned to Lupton. Not that year. Not any year going back through their records. But the investigator wasn't calling just to tell me that. She said they'd had other reports from that same stretch of road going back almost a decade. Always late at night. Always a solo driver. Always somebody waved off the scale toward that same gravel lot, on nights the station happened to be closed. Most of those drivers, like me, had just gotten a bad feeling and left. A couple hadn't been heard from again on schedule, and their disappearances had gotten written off over the years as guys walking away from the job, which happens more than people think. Drivers who just cut their radio and vanish into a different life. Nobody had ever connected those cases to a man in a fake vest standing in the dark. What finally got dropped in my lap a month later was the part that took the floor out from under me. They'd found a storage unit rented under a name that didn't check out past Chambers, with a couple of vests in it, a stack of fake credentials, and a notebook. My name was in that notebook, along with my home terminal, the company I drove for, my usual run schedule, and my daughter's name, which I have never once said out loud to a stranger on the side of a highway. He'd known that, before I ever rolled up to that scale. Whoever he was, he hadn't picked me at random that night. He'd already had me picked out, probably weeks before, pulled together from load boards or dispatch chatter or however guys like that piece a person's life apart from a distance, and he was just waiting for the right closed night to make his approach. They never caught him. The unit had been cleared out days before anyone got a warrant, like he knew, or got lucky, or both. I still run that stretch of I-40 for work, because it's the job, but I don't run it alone anymore if I can help it, and I don't stop for anything on that road after dark that isn't lit up with other trucks around it. Every couple months, somebody posts in one of the trucker groups online about a guy in a faded vest waving them off a scale somewhere between Lupton and Chambers. Always at night, always when the station should have been closed. And every time I read one of those posts, I feel that gravel under my boots again, and that quiet where a man used to be standing. That, if you're wondering, is a sensitive topic for me, and for a lot of drivers out there who run solo at night. So if any part of this has you sitting with something heavier than just a good scare, it's worth talking to someone you trust, or a professional who can help you carry it. The stretch between Sanders and Chambers is the kind of dark you don't get most places anymore. No town glow, no farmhouse porch lights, nothing but the 2 lanes and the white line, and whatever the high beams catch before it disappears again. Deke was in the sleeper, curtain pulled, snoring through his second REM cycle, and I had the wheel for the 3 a.m. leg, because that's how we split it. He took the front half through Flagstaff. I took us through the flats past the park boundary, mile marker 311, and on into Chambers where we'd swap again. Routine. We'd run that swap 100 times. I noticed the lights around 311. Off to the right, low over what should have been nothing but scrub and painted clay. and about 9 miles of federal land, with no road, no maintenance trail, not even a fence line marked on the GPS. 2 lights, amber white, holding maybe 40-50 feet off the deck, keeping pace, maybe a half-mile out past the shoulder. My first thought was a spotter plane, maybe Border Patrol running the corridor, since they do fly low out there some nights. I clocked my speed, 63, held it steady, watched the lights. They held too. Didn't gain, didn't fall back, just sat there in my peripheral, like they were pinned to the truck with a string. I eased off to 58 to see what would happen, telling myself I was testing a coincidence, not really believing there was one to test. The lights bled back with me, matched it inside maybe 4 seconds. No drift, no overcorrection, like a plane banking to hold formation. A plane doesn't slow down that clean. A plane doesn't slow down at all for one truck on an empty highway. That was the first time my stomach actually dropped, because up until then, some part of me was still doing math that ended in somebody's night flight, and the math stopped working the second those lights caught my brake check, like they'd been waiting on it. I reached back and shook the curtain until Deke came up swearing, and by the time he got his eyes working, the lights were still out there, still holding that same half-mile, like they'd been patient with me, and now they were being patient with him too. He didn't say anything for a while, just watched them out his side glass with his jaw tight, and then he said, real quiet, "Key the CB." So I did, and I called out our mile marker plane. No name, just asking if anybody eastbound or westbound was seeing what we were seeing near 311. Dead air for a stretch that felt longer than it was. Then a voice came back, older, tired sounding, not the least bit surprised. He said he wasn't near us, but he knew exactly where we were. And he told us, flat, like reading off a checklist, don't flash your brights at them. Don't slow down under 50. Don't key up asking questions on this channel, because half the guys running nights out here have stopped answering when it happens, and just keep rolling till you see the Chambers sign. He said it like he'd said it before, to somebody else, on some other night. That was worse than the lights, honestly. The lights were strange. The calm in that man's voice was the first thing that told me this wasn't new, that there was a whole quiet layer of the road we'd never been let in on until tonight. We kept it right at 62, both of us awake now, both of us not saying much. And about 2 miles out from the exit, Deke sat up straight and said, "There," and pointed at the shoulder ahead. Hazards. A vehicle pulled half onto the gravel, with its flashers going. No headlights on the tractor lane side. Somebody's shape standing near the back of it, waving an arm slow, like they'd been standing there a while. Every instinct built into 11 years of driving says you ease up for that. You call it in. You check your mirrors and consider stopping to help, because that's what you do out here, where a breakdown at 3 a.m. can be somebody's whole night going bad. My foot was already coming off the pedal before Deke grabbed my arm and said, "Don't. Not here. Not tonight. Remember what the man said." I looked at the lights, pacing us in the side mirror, then at that shape on the shoulder, getting bigger in the windshield, and something about the timing of it, the two things happening together, made the decision for me. I held 62. We went past close enough to see the arm still waving in the mirror, and neither of us said a word until the Chambers exit sign came up reflective in the headlights. The second we crossed under it, the lights were just gone. Not fading, not banking off toward the horizon the way a plane would. Gone between one blink and the next, like a hand had been cupped over them. We pulled into the truck stop at Chambers, still not talking, and the first thing Deke did was pull the SD card out of the dash cam, before we'd even set the brake. Nothing on it, but a smear across 4 frames. A streak of light, with no shape to it. The kind of thing that proves something happened, and proves nothing about what it was. We logged it that morning as possible aircraft, because that's the box on the incident form, and neither of us had a better word yet. What came later, over the next couple weeks, is the part that actually changed how I think about that night. A dispatcher named Terry, who'd been doing this longer than either of us had been alive, pulled us aside at the yard and asked real specific questions. Not about lights in the sky, but about the vehicle on the shoulder, what it looked like, whether anybody was actually near it, or just near enough to be seen. When we described the arm waving, slow, mechanical almost, She got quiet, the way that CB voice had gotten quiet. And she told us a company out of Gallup had lost a rig 2 weeks before ours. Full trailer of electronics. Driver found walking the interstate the next morning, with a concussion, and no memory of stopping. No memory of anything past a car with its hazards on, near that same stretch. She said the county had started quietly comparing notes with 2 other carriers about drones being used to scout loads at night, spotting which trucks were worth stopping, then staging a breakdown to get a driver to slow down and get close enough to box in. The lights weren't a plane, and they weren't anything from beyond us. They were somebody's eyes, flown by somebody's hands, watching to see if we'd take the bait. We never found out for certain if that shape on the shoulder that night was part of the same operation, or just an unlucky stranger we drove past without helping. And that's a thing I still turn over some nights, whether we did right by a person in trouble, or dodged the exact trap that took another crew's whole night from them. What I do know is the company quietly rerouted every team running that corridor after midnight within the month. No bulletin, no big announcement, just a note, buried in the load planning software, that says, avoid 311 to chambers, between 0100 and 0500 where possible. Deke and I still run that highway plenty, just never in the dark anymore, and we don't talk about it much except late at night in some other truck stop, when somebody new to the seat asks why the old hands go quiet around mile marker 311. I've hauled reefer for going on 12 years now, mostly produce out of the Central Valley, sometimes frozen protein out east, and I used to think I'd already seen the worst a 53-foot box could hold. Blown pallets of strawberries cooking in their own juice for 600 miles. A raccoon that got sealed in with a load of onions and didn't make it past Barstow. Stuff that turns your stomach once, and then you forget by the next fuel island. I bring that up because I need you to know I'm not a man who spooks easy. And whatever I tell you here, I told the same way. Flat, to 2 different detectives, because flat is the only way I've found to get through it without my hands shaking. The run that week started at a cold storage dock outside Oklahoma City, a mixed load of packaged chicken heading for a distribution center in California. Standard pickup. I signed the bill of lading, watched the door get sealed, checked the number against my paperwork like I do every time, and rolled out a little after 10 at night to get ahead of the heat across Texas. Nothing about that load felt different from 400 others I've pulled the same way. First thing that struck me wrong was outside Amarillo, maybe 5 hours in. My reefer temp was running 2 degrees warm on the readout, which isn't nothing, but isn't panic either. Unit fans work overtime when a door seal's a little tired, and I'd been meaning to get that door looked at for a month. I bumped the set point, made a note to call maintenance, and kept rolling. Second thing was at the fuel island in Gallup. I was standing at the pump around 3 in the morning, half asleep on my feet, and I heard something shift inside the box. One solid thud like a pallet had come loose. I've heard that sound 100 times on rough New Mexico pavement. Product settling, a strap letting go a half inch. I didn't even walk back there. I climbed up in my cab, logged my fuel, and went another 200 miles. By the time I rolled into Holbrook, I was out of hours anyway, federal clock forcing me down for the night, and the reefer was still running warm enough that I figured I'd better actually open the doors and look instead of guessing. 2 in the morning, that stretch of Route 66 dead quiet, except for the hum of parked units in the truck stop lot. Sodium lights turning everything the color of a bruise. I broke the seal, cranked the handle, and swung both doors open, expecting a shifted pallet. What I found instead was a space cleared out behind the last row of boxes, maybe 3 feet by 4, walled in on 3 sides by product, so nobody glancing in from outside would ever see it. Inside that gap, somebody had built a nest out of 2 moving blankets. I keep bungeed to the headache rack for load protection, folded and refolded so many times they'd gone soft as bed sheets. There was a granola bar wrapper flattened under one corner and wedged down against the floor rail, half under a pallet foot. 1 small shoe, pink, Velcro strap, a size that told me whoever wore it hadn't hit 1st grade yet. I stood there with the cold air rolling out over my boots for longer than I want to admit. Then I saw the marks, scratched into the cardboard sheeting on the wall of that little cleared pocket, low down, kid height, 3 short lines and a fourth one crossing them out, the way you'd count days if you didn't have anything else to count with. I want to say my first thought was for whoever that shoe belonged to. If I'm being honest with you the way I promised, my first thought was for myself. It was almost 4 in the morning. I had an appointment in Barstow that afternoon, and calling this in meant every hour of delay came straight out of my pocket and probably out of my job. I actually had the blankets bunched up in my arms, halfway to the dumpster behind the fuel island, telling myself the kid was clearly gone now. The box was empty. Tossing this stuff wasn't hiding a crime. It was just cleaning my truck. I got maybe 10 feet before I stopped and made myself put it back exactly where I found it, and called my dispatcher instead, and she told me to call 911 before I'd even finished the sentence. 2 Navajo County units showed up first, then Highway Patrol, and by 5 a.m., there were 4 cars, and a supervisor's truck lit up in that lot, and I was sitting on the tailgate of somebody's Tahoe answering the same 6 questions in different order. I want to be clear that being the guy who called it in did not buy me any benefit of the doubt. They ran my license. They went through my phone. They pulled my logs and my fuel receipts and cross-checked every mile against my ELD, while I sat there in the cold with a blanket somebody'd given me that I didn't ask for. Because from where they were standing, a lone driver hauling an empty stretch of trailer, with evidence a child had been living in it for days, looks exactly like what it would look like if I'd put her there myself. I didn't get angry about it. I understood it, even while it was happening to me. It didn't make the 8 hours in that lot any shorter. What finally moved things along wasn't anything I said. One of the detectives, a woman named Ochoa, pulled the seal off my door and read the number into her radio, then looked at my bill of lading, then looked at me different. The seal on my trailer didn't match the number written on my paperwork from Oklahoma City. Close, same manufacturer, same color band, wrong by 2 digits. Somebody had cut the original seal and replaced it with one that would pass a glance, which meant whatever happened to that trailer didn't happen because a kid found an unlocked door and climbed in out of the cold. Somebody with tools and time had done this on purpose, and my alibi for the loading dock, time-stamped gate logs showing me inside the office, getting my paperwork signed at the exact window that door would have needed to be worked on, was the only reason Ochoa's whole posture toward me changed. She didn't thank me exactly. What she told me, once, quiet, like she was giving me something she wasn't supposed to, was that the shoe matched a description on file from a missing child case out of Oklahoma, open since spring. She wouldn't give me a name, wouldn't tell me the girl's age past young, wouldn't tell me if they thought she'd still been in my trailer recently or weeks ago, wouldn't tell me anything else at all. And when I asked if they thought she was alive, she just told me the case was active and that I should get some sleep. I didn't get any sleep. Not that day, and not really since. What I did, about 3 weeks later, sitting in a different lot, in a different state, waiting on a different load, was pull out the box of dashcam cards I keep out of habit in case I'm ever in an accident and somebody needs footage. I wasn't even looking for anything related. I was checking an old card because a broker was disputing a delivery time. And on that card, from a truck stop outside Elk City, 3 weeks before I ever picked up in Oklahoma City, time-stamped just after midnight, my trailer doors crack open on camera for 11 minutes, while I'm asleep in the cab 20 feet away. 2 adults on the footage, faces turned from the lens the whole time, like they knew exactly where it was mounted, boosting something small up into the box between them. Then the doors close. Then, and this is the part that still gets me, one of them runs a hand along the bottom edge of the door like they're checking its flush, like they've done it before, and know what flush is supposed to look like. That footage meant the nest I found wasn't built in one desperate night by a kid running from something at a rest stop. It meant my trailer, or trailers running my same lane, had been used this way before that Oklahoma pickup, which meant it wasn't a single terrible accident that happened to intersect my truck. It was a route. It was a system somebody had already tested on me once and was using again, and I'd driven 400 miles a day for 3 weeks, with no idea my rig had already been used for this exact thing, and left clean enough that I never noticed. I handed that card over too. Ochoa took it without much reaction. The kind of no reaction that told me it confirmed something they already suspected, more than it surprised them. I asked her straight out if there were other drivers, other rigs, if this was bigger than one kid and one trailer. She said she couldn't discuss an active investigation, and I understood by then that meant yes. Months went by. Nobody called. I got one form letter thanking me for my cooperation and confirming the case remained open, which is the kind of sentence that tells you nothing and closes nothing at the same time. Then this spring, sitting at a counter in a truck stop outside Flagstaff, I overheard two drivers a few stools down talking about a body recovered off a county road outside Elk City, tied loosely in their conversation to that same open Oklahoma case, though neither of them had it straight, and neither did the two paragraphs I found online afterward. The dates in that story didn't sit right against what I'd seen on my own dashcam, which either meant the case they found wasn't the same girl at all, or it was, and the timeline the detectives believed didn't match what actually happened in the back of my trailer that spring. I don't know which. Nobody's told me, and I've stopped expecting anyone to. What I know is a kid rode in the back of my truck for at least 2 fuel stops, and probably longer, and somewhere along a highway I've driven 100 times, there's a family who either got her back or didn't, and I will never get to know her name or which one it was. What I do now is simple. Every load, every stop, before I ever break a seal for delivery, I open both doors and look all the way to the nose, every pallet, every gap big enough to hide a person in, whether the paperwork calls for it or not. Dispatch thinks I'm slow. I don't correct them. I check behind every load I pull now, every single one, and I still don't know, after all of it, whether what I did that night in Holbrook is the reason somebody's daughter came home, or the reason she didn't. I still key up on Channel 19 when I pass that stretch outside Joseph City, even though there's nobody left who'd recognize my voice on the other end. Old habit, the kind you don't examine too closely, because if you did, you'd have to admit you're doing it for a woman who's been gone 3 years now, and that you're hoping, in some small stupid corner of yourself, that she can still hear you. Dana trained me, not officially. We drove for the same outfit out of Flagstaff, hauling freight along the old 40 corridor, and when I started, she'd already logged 15 years and had opinions about everything, from tire chains to gas station coffee. She had a laugh that carried through a headset like it was standing next to you. She ran nights mostly, said the desert at 2 a.m. was the only time the world left her alone. I believed her. That stretch past Joseph City is about as alone as a place gets. Flat scrub on both sides, the shell of the old cotton gin standing up out of the dark, like something that gave up on itself, and maybe 4 working streetlights between the exit and the county line. It was October when she called me the first time about the voice, not radioed. Called, on her cell, pulled over on the shoulder with her hazards going, which for Dana was already strange. She said a girl had come over 19 right around the gin, clear as anything, no static, no skip, and asked her to slow down. Just that. Please slow down. Dana said she figured it was some kid messing with a base station on a ranch somewhere, bored on a school night, and she'd keyed back with something smart about how she was already doing 55 in a 55. Thanks. No answer. She laughed about it when she told me. I laughed too. Second night, same time, same channel, the voice again. Except now, it had a marker number attached to it. Slow down past 269. Specific in a way that didn't sit right with either of us, though neither of us said why out loud. Dana still had jokes about it. She was already building the story she'd tell at the yard the next morning, the one about the phantom dispatcher with a curfew. By the third night, she wasn't laughing when she called. She said the voice sounded younger than she'd first thought, and scared, and it didn't say please this time. It said they're not slowing down, like it was reporting something in progress, not warning about something that might happen. She said she'd asked the girl who she was, and gotten nothing back but 3 seconds of open mic and breathing, and then nothing at all for the rest of the run. Dana didn't like open silence on a channel. She said it felt like someone deciding not to answer, which is different from nobody being there. I told her what everybody tells you when you don't want to sit with something. It's skip. CB signals bounce off the atmosphere sometimes and travel for hundreds of miles, and you can pick up a trucker in Nebraska as easy as 1-2 exits back. I told her it was probably some kid 3 states over, playing with his dad's rig radio. She wanted to believe that. I wanted her to believe it. We left it there. A week later, a tanker jackknifed on black ice just past the gin, right around marker 269, and a family in a minivan that had slowed down for a stalled pickup got caught underneath it when the trailer came around. 3 people died at the scene. It happened at 2:14 in the morning, which was close enough to when Dana usually ran that stretch, that for about 6 hours, nobody at the yard could get hold of her, and I remember standing in the break room with my hands shaking around a coffee I wasn't drinking, because she'd swapped runs that week with another driver, last minute, for reasons she never fully explained to me. She wasn't on the road that night. She was 300 miles away, with her radio off, and she still says it was the worst morning of her life, worse than if she'd been there, because now she had to live with the idea that something had tried to tell her, specifically her, and she'd shrugged it off as a bored teenager. We went looking after that, the way you do when you need the world to make sense again. There's a diner outside Winslow, where the old-timers still hold court over eggs at 5 a.m., men who'd been running that corridor since before it was I-40, back when it was just the 2-lane blacktop people call Route 66 now. One of them, a man named Curtis, who'd hauled cattle feed for 40 years, told us there'd been a girl killed near that gin a long time back, hit trying to flag a truck down to help her mother, whose car had died on the shoulder, 50-some years ago, he thought. Nobody slowed down for her either. That much lined up clean, almost too clean, like a story handing itself to you gift-wrapped, and for a while we let ourselves have it. A girl who died trying to get drivers to slow down, still trying, decades later. It fit. Except Curtis wasn't finished, and what he said next is the part that stayed lodged in me longer than any ghost story would have. He said that wasn't the only time. He said there'd been a bad wreck at that same stretch back in the 80s too, and another one before that. He only half remembered, and every single time, if you asked around long enough, somebody would tell you they'd heard a girl's voice on 19 in the nights before it happened. Not the same girl necessarily. Not even, he said. Definitely a girl at all. Just something that came across sounding like one. Young and worried. Always at that same bend of road. He said it like it didn't bother him anymore. The way you talk about weather you've stopped being surprised by. That was worse than if he'd told us it was a haunting. A haunting has an ending. This didn't have one. It had a pattern, and the pattern was older than the explanation we'd wanted to give it. Dana stopped taking that route after the tanker. She moved to dispatch inside a year, said her knees were giving her trouble, which might even have been half true. We stayed close. Closer, actually, once she was the one sending me out, instead of running her own loads. She'd get quiet on the radio when I came up on marker 269 at night, not saying anything, just staying on the line a little longer than the job required, like she wanted a witness in case I needed one. I never heard the voice. Not once, not in 6 years of night runs through that stretch. I started to think Dana's mind had done what minds do under stress, made something out of static, and grief, and a bad week. And I never said that to her, but I think she knew I thought it, and I think it hurt her a little, and I'm sorry for that now, in a way I can't fix. Dana died on a Tuesday in March, in a hospital in Flagstaff, of something ordinary and cruel that had been growing in her for longer than anyone caught. No wreck, no highway, nothing that fit the shape of the story we'd half built around her. Just a woman in a bed, and a diagnosis that came too late, and a funeral with more truckers in attendance than I've ever seen wear a tie. I drove her old Tuesday night route myself, 2 months later, not because dispatch asked me to, but because I asked them to, and I told myself it was about keeping her seniority slot filled, and not about anything else. I hit marker 269 a little after 2 a.m. The gin came up on my left, the way it always does, black against a sky that still had some purple left in it, and channel 19 was doing what it usually does out there, which is nothing, just the low hush of an open frequency with no one on it. Then it wasn't nothing. A voice, young, clear, no static riding under it at all, said, "Please, slow down. There's a truck sideways past the curve. Its lights are out." I didn't think. I took my foot off and let the rig bleed speed the way you do on instinct before your brains caught up with your hands. And 40 yards past the bend, there was a cattle hauler jackknifed half across both lanes. Dark, hazards dead, a driver standing on the shoulder waving a flashlight that was almost too weak to see. I stopped in time. I don't know if I'd have stopped in time otherwise. I've run the math on it more nights than I want to admit. The seconds it would have taken me to see those dark shapes on my own. And I don't like where the math lands. I keyed up after, hands not steady, and said thank you into the open channel, not really expecting anything, the way you'd thank a stranger who'd already walked off. And for the first time in every version of this story I'd ever heard, the voice answered. It didn't explain itself. It didn't tell me a name or a year or a single fact I could go look up and confirm or disprove. It just said, "Real quiet. Tell her I've been trying." Then the channel went back to hush and stayed that way the rest of the drive, and I sat with that sentence the whole way to Gallup, because I didn't have anybody left to tell her to, not the way it meant. I still don't know what ran that channel that night, or the nights before Dana ever picked up a microphone, or the nights that'll come after mine. I know drivers out of that yard still swap the story at the fuel islands, half laughing when they tell it, the way you laugh at something to keep it at arm's length. And I know that every one of them, without exception, slows down past that gin at night, whether they believe a word of it or not. Nobody wants to say out loud that they respect it. They just do it anyway, foot easing off the pedal a quarter mile out, headlights sweeping that dead grain elevator like it might be watching back. I do it too, every single time. And every single time, right before the marker, I say her name out loud in the cab, quiet, just for me, in case somebody out there past Channel 19 is still listening and still keeping score of who slowed down and who didn't. The board had 11 trucks on it that Tuesday, and Marcus Webb's was the only one I wasn't watching closely. Unit 4471, empty flatbed heading west on 40, Gallup to Flagstaff, a leg we ran probably twice a week. 90 minutes through Winslow, if he kept 65. No way stations on that stretch. No construction. Nothing. I'd clocked him leaving the yard at 6:04 in the morning and figured I wouldn't hear from him again until he called in for his next pickup number around 7:30. At 7:41 I pinged him because the board still showed him 15 miles east of where he should have been. No answer. That happens. Sometimes a driver's got his phone in the sleeper charging and doesn't hear the chime for 10, 15 minutes. I made a note and moved on to the next truck. By 8:15, I stopped moving on. I called dispatch supervisor Trent and told him I had a driver gone dark on a leg with 0 recorded dead zones in 11 years of running that corridor. He told me to check the ELD before I started treating a phone silence like a missing person. I pulled it up. The log showed motion. Steady 62. 64 miles an hour, engine RPMs consistent with cruise, no idle time, no stops. According to the box, Marcus was driving fine. According to everything else, he'd vanished. I called Arizona DPS non-emergency and asked if there'd been any incidents on 40 near Winslow that morning. Nothing. No accidents, no closures, no reports of a flatbed on the shoulder. I called the truck stop at the Winslow exit and asked if anyone remembered seeing our rig. The guy at the counter said he hadn't, but he also hadn't been outside much. I sat with my headset on and watched a little blue triangle crawl across a map at a speed that made no sense, given that nobody, not the highway patrol, not the truck stop, not another driver on the same road, had laid eyes on him. At 12:47, 6 hours and 43 minutes after he left the yard, Marcus called in. His voice was normal. A little tired, maybe, the way anybody sounds after a long stretch behind the wheel. He gave me his arrival number and asked why dispatch had blown up his phone. I told him it was 12:47. There was a pause on the line, and then he said that couldn't be right. He'd left at 6, and it felt like maybe an hour and a half had gone by. Tops. He said he remembered the on-ramp. He remembered the exit into Flagstaff. He did not. when I pushed him gently, remember anything about the 60-some miles in between, including Winslow itself, which you cannot drive through on that stretch without seeing it. Corporate's answer was the answer corporate always has for something they can't explain and don't want to spend money explaining. Cell tower issue, GPS drift, a known glitch with that model of ELD unit that IT had flagged twice that year on unrelated trucks. Trent told me to write it up as a connectivity anomaly, no further action, and close the ticket before end of shift. I did what I was told. That's the job. You don't get paid to be curious. You get paid to keep the board clean. Marcus put in a written request 2 days later, asking to never be routed through Winslow again, on any leg, for any reason. He didn't give an explanation, and nobody in scheduling asked for one, because drivers get particular about routes all the time. Bad memories from an old wreck, a bad diner, whatever. I let it go too, for about a week. What pulled me back in was the fuel card. I was closing out the file so it could be archived, and I happened to glance at the tank readings from that morning, before and after the gap, because I wanted the mileage to match the hours for my own report. A flatbed, running 6.5 hours at highway speed, burns through a real chunk of a tank. His reading at 6:04 was 3/4 full. His reading at 12:47 was still 3/4 full, down maybe an eighth, which is what you'd expect from an hour and a half of driving, not 6.5. Either somebody topped him off somewhere with no receipt and no stop logged, which never happens on our cards without a transaction hitting the system within seconds, or the truck had not actually been moving anywhere near as much as the ELD claimed it had. I sat with that for a long time. A glitch explains missing data. It doesn't explain data that lies in two directions at once, showing motion that didn't burn fuel and a driver who lived through time that didn't happen. I brought it to Trent, and he told me, not unkindly, that I was overthinking a closed ticket and that IT owned the hardware issue, not dispatch. I said okay. Then I went back to my desk and pulled every ticket filed for incidents on the Winslow stretch of 40, going back as far as our system retained records, which turned out to be 11 years. There were 14 of them. Different drivers, different trucks, different companies some years since we'd been through 2 ownership changes, but the shape of it never changed. A leg that should take under 2 hours, turning into anywhere from 4 to 7. No dead zone on record. The ELD always showing continuous motion the whole time. The driver always coming back with no memory of the middle of it, and total clarity on either end. And every single one of those 14 tickets closed the same day, using the same internal override code, filed as a connectivity anomaly, no further action. Several of those drivers, according to the personnel notes stapled behind the tickets, requested a reroute around Winslow afterward. 4 of them quit within 2 months. 1 of them quit the same week. I wanted to know who kept closing these so fast, so cleanly, every time, across 11 years and 2 different companies running the same yard. The override code traces back to a dispatcher ID. I pulled the ID. It came back retired, deactivated, no longer in the current system, the kind of number that only gets assigned once and then gets buried when somebody leaves. I almost let it go right there, because a deactivated ID from before I even started this job shouldn't have meant anything to me. Then I recognized the number. It was mine, the one I was issued back when I drove instead of dispatched, back before I asked for a desk job, and everyone assumed it was because I wanted better hours and to be home with my kid instead of living in a sleeper cab 3 weeks a month. Nobody ever asked me the real reason, and I never offered it, because for 11 years I had told myself it was a glitch too. Same stretch of road, same 6 hours gone, same certainty, when I called it in back then, that maybe 90 minutes had passed. I filed the report myself. I watched it get closed the same day, under that code, the code that apparently every single one of these 14 tickets after mine has been quietly filed under ever since. Like my old case became the template nobody had to think about twice. I don't have an answer for what happens on that stretch of highway. I want to be honest about that, because I've turned it over enough times now to know there isn't a clean one sitting at the bottom waiting for me. What I have is fuel that doesn't burn, motion that doesn't match a living person's memory, 14 other names besides Marcus's, and besides mine, and a company that has spent over a decade closing this exact file with the same 3 words every time. Connectivity anomaly. No further action. I didn't write that this time. I called Marcus off the dispatch line on my own phone, and I told him I believed him, and I asked him to write down anything at all from those hours, even something that felt like nothing. A smell, a sound, a color. Whatever fragment might still be sitting somewhere behind the part of his memory that answered the phone at 12:47, sounding so calm. I told Trent I wasn't signing off on the ticket as resolved, and that I wanted my own file from 11 years ago, pulled out of wherever it's been sitting since I buried it myself, without ever admitting that's what I was doing. I still don't know what's waiting in that gap outside Winslow, but I know it's not nothing, and after 11 years of writing that word down because it was easier than the truth, I finally said out loud that I don't know, and I'm not closing this one. I'd been awake for 19 hours when I saw him standing at the Two Guns exit, and by then I couldn't tell anymore if the ache behind my eyes was tiredness or something else. The load was refrigerated produce, Phoenix to Albuquerque, and I'd taken it because the rate was good and because I told myself I could push through one more night if I kept the coffee coming and the window cracked. That's the lie every driver tells himself at some point. I'd told it to myself around Kingman, and I was still telling it somewhere past Winslow. The dash light's the only warm color in 60 miles of black highway. Two Guns isn't much anymore. Just some crumbling walls off the frontage road. An old zoo enclosure with the mesh rusted through. A gas station that burned years back and never got rebuilt. Truckers know it because of the exit sign for Meteor Crater Road, not because anyone stops there on purpose. I only pulled onto the shoulder near it because my legs had gone stiff, and I needed 2 minutes standing up before my eyes started doing that thing where the white lines multiply. That's when I saw him, off to the side of the ruins, a duffel bag over one shoulder, not moving toward the road, not doing anything to flag anybody down, just standing there, like he'd been waiting for the right vehicle. I want to be honest, company policy says no riders, no exceptions, and I've followed that rule for 6 years without breaking it once. But it was 2 in the morning, and I was alone, with a windshield full of nothing, and a body that wanted to shut down, whether I gave it permission or not. Having another set of eyes in the cab felt, in that moment, like the smarter risk. He didn't say much getting in, told me his name was Dale, said he'd had a ride drop him outside Flagstaff and never made it any farther. He smelled like cold air and diesel. Nothing stranger than that. I pulled back onto the interstate, glad for the company, glad for anything that would keep me talking instead of drifting. About 20 minutes in, somewhere past the Crater Road cutoff, he asked how many pallets I was hauling. I hadn't said anything about the load at all. Not the count, not the customer. I told him 26, out of habit more than thought, and he nodded like he already knew that, then said something about the Albuquerque cross-dock needing it by 6 for the produce transfer. That's not information you get from looking at a trailer. That's dispatch information, buyer information, the kind of detail that lives in a load confirmation email and nowhere else. I laughed it off, told myself I must have said the destination out loud earlier without registering it. That exhaustion does strange things to what you think you remember saying. We drove on. He didn't ask for the radio, didn't ask to stop, just sat with his bag between his boots and looked out at the dark, like he was counting mile markers I couldn't see. Somewhere around Two Guns fading into my mirrors, my dispatcher had texted me a private detour, off the books, a favor for a broker who needed an extra pallet grabbed from a lot outside Holbrook that wasn't on my paperwork. Nobody knew about that text except me and her. I hadn't mentioned it to Dale. I hadn't mentioned it to anybody. And 40 minutes later, with the exit for Holbrook coming up, he turned to me and asked if we were still swinging by for the extra pickup. I didn't answer him right away. I couldn't. My mouth had gone dry in a way that had nothing to do with the heater running. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that maybe he worked logistics himself, that maybe he'd overheard something back at a truck stop, that coincidences happened to exhausted men driving through the night more than they'd like to admit. But some part of my chest had gone tight and stayed that way, and I found myself gripping the wheel harder than I needed to. watching him out of the corner of my eye instead of the road. The next stretch is where things get thin in my memory, and I mean that literally, like a signal losing reception. I remember the exit sign for Holbrook passing over us. I remember thinking I should say something, ask him straight out how he knew what he knew, and then the next clear thought I have is mile marker 316, which put us almost 40 minutes past where I thought we were, with no memory of the road in between. 40 minutes of my hands on the wheel, my foot on the pedal, doing 75 down a 2-lane stretch of interstate, and nothing left behind from it. Not a gas station passing, not another car's headlights, nothing, just gone. I've had microsleeps before. Every long-haul driver has, that half second where your eyelids win and you come back to find you've drifted a few feet in your lane. This wasn't that. 40 minutes is not a blink. 40 minutes is a stretch where you should remember something, anything, even if it's just boredom. And through the entire gap, Dale hadn't moved. Same position, bag between his boots, same angle of his head against the window, like a photograph of a man riding in a truck rather than an actual man riding in one. I asked him if he'd said anything to me in the last while. He said no, said I'd been quiet as a church the whole way. I told him I must have lost track of time. He said that happens on long stretches, and there was something in the flatness of his voice that didn't match the concern a stranger's voice should have when the man driving him at highway speed admits he can't account for the last several miles. Not long after that, I caught a green exit sign flash by that stopped my heart for a second, because it was the same exit number I was almost positive I'd already passed once, over an hour earlier. I checked my log, checked the GPS, and the math didn't sit right no matter how I turned it. Either I'd looped back somewhere without noticing, which made no sense on an interstate with no reason to turn around, or the miles themselves had gotten confused, which made even less sense. I've driven this corridor more times than I can count. I know it in my sleep, which under the circumstances was not a comforting thing to realize. Something about the dark outside the window looked wrong, in a way I couldn't name, less like unfamiliar road, and more like the same road doubling back on itself, folding somewhere I couldn't see the seam. Dale didn't react to any of it. When I said out loud, mostly to myself, that something wasn't adding up with the mileage, he just told me to keep driving, said the next stop wasn't far now, said it in a tone that had shifted from passenger small talk into something closer to instruction. It was the first time since Two Guns that I felt something under my unease that was closer to fear. I didn't argue. I just drove, watching him more than the road, until the lights of a travel plaza came up out of the dark, like a lit island in all that nothing, and I pulled in, with a kind of relief I hadn't let myself feel in hours. I told him this was as far as I could take him, which wasn't true. My route ran another 200 miles past there, but I wanted him out of my cab, and I wanted 5 minutes alone to think straight. He said that was fine, thanked me, reached for his bag. I went inside first, told him I needed the bathroom, told myself I'd sort him out with a coffee, and send him on his way once my head cleared. When I came back out 4 minutes later, the cab was empty, and the door was shut the way I'd left it. I checked my mirrors on instinct, some old habit from years of driving, and I hadn't seen him walk off toward the building, or the pumps, or the dark beyond the lot lights. He was just gone, the way steam disappears off a windshield once the defrost catches up, there and then not. I told myself he'd slipped past while I was distracted. That 4 minutes is enough time for a grown man to walk anywhere he wants in a truck stop lot. But something about the emptiness of that cab put a cold weight low in my stomach, and I climbed back up into the seat to check if he'd left anything behind, half hoping he had, so I'd have proof to myself that I hadn't spent the last hour talking to something I built out of exhaustion and static. The seat was cold, colder than the rest of the cab, and there was a smear of red dust across the vinyl that hadn't been there when I picked him up. The kind of dust that only comes off ground that's been baked and cracked for years. Ground like what's under those ruins back at Two Guns. Wedged down in the seam of the cushion was a laminated card, half broken, a photo on it faded past recognition, and a name that wasn't Dale. I sat there with it in my hand a long time, not able to make my mind settle on what it meant, whether it belonged to him or to somebody else entirely. Somebody whose name I didn't know, and might never. My rig has a forward and cab-facing camera feed that dumps to the company server every few hours, mostly for insurance and hours of service disputes. And in the state I was in, sitting there in that lot, I wanted to see it more than I've ever wanted to see anything. I pulled it up on my phone through the Fleet app while the engine idled around me. I watched the clip from 2 guns forward, watched myself pull onto the shoulder, watched myself climb down and stretch, watched myself climb back in. And the passenger seat, the whole time, every frame of it, sat empty. No door opening, no second body settling into the vinyl. Just me, alone, talking to a seat that had nobody in it, for the better part of 300 miles. I don't know how long I sat there with that footage looping, my own voice coming out of the speaker asking questions into an empty cab, before I made myself get out and walk the length of the trailer, because some instinct under the fear told me to check it before I let myself fall apart completely. The seal on the rear doors wasn't the one I'd signed for back in Phoenix. Same style, same color, wrong number entirely. And when I broke it and hauled the door up, half my pallets were gone, swapped out for something else stacked to look right from a glance. Boxes with no manifest match, no customer name I recognized. Somewhere in those miles I couldn't account for, my real freight had been pulled and replaced, clean and quiet, while I sat up front seeing a man who was never on any camera at all. When I got my dispatcher on the phone, half out of my mind, trying to explain a hitchhiker no footage backed up, and a trailer that wasn't carrying what it should, she went quiet, in a way that told me more than anything she actually said. She told me to just file the incident report and let the insurance side handle it. And right before she hung up, almost like an afterthought, she said this was the 3rd rig out of that stretch this year, with a story close enough to mine that the company had stopped mentioning it out loud. I asked her what happened to the other 2 drivers. She said one of them quit driving altogether. She didn't say anything about the 3rd. I still don't know what got into my cab that night at 2 Guns. Whether it was a man clever enough to beat a camera, or just the shape my mind built out of 19 hours awake, and too many stories about that stretch of road. But something out there knew my load before I ever said a word about it, and something took it clean while I sat believing I had company. I've driven that route 100 times since, and I still find myself glancing at the shoulder near those ruins, half hoping I never see anybody standing there again, and half afraid that if I do, I'll pull over anyway. I want to say up front that I know how this sounds. I've told it enough times now that I can watch people's faces change halfway through, that look where they're deciding whether to keep listening to me or start feeling sorry for me. Either one's fine. I just need to get it out the way it actually happened, not the version that makes me look better. Dale and I ran team for a reefer outfit out of Phoenix. Had for about 3 years. Same truck, alternating the wheel so the thing never had to stop rolling. That week the company was short on team freight, so they split us onto solo loads for a few days. Both of us headed toward Gallup, figuring we'd meet back up at the yard and swap into the truck together like always. I had a load drop in Flagstaff and was waiting on a part for the reefer unit, killing time at a pilot off Butler. And that's where I was that morning, when Dale and I got into it over the phone about a fuel receipt he said I owed him for. Stupid thing. $40-some. But it turned into one of those fights where you're not really fighting about the money anymore. I hung up on him, and I did something I'm not proud of. I put my phone face down on the dash, and I left it there. I want to be clear that I didn't know the storm was coming in as fast as it did. Nobody did. Not really. Not until the DPS started blowing up every trucker's radio with closure warnings. But I knew the forecast had snow in it, and I knew Dale was still sore at me, and some small, ugly part of me figured let him stew a while. Let him be the one who calls back first. So when his name started popping up on my screen, face down on that dash, I didn't turn it over. Not for 2 hours. Maybe closer to 3. When I finally did pick up the phone, it wasn't Dale calling anymore. It was dispatch, and the first thing out of the woman's mouth was Twin Arrows. She said his truck had gone dead right past the Twin Arrows exit, that he'd called it in an hour before but they'd lost him after that, and that DPS had the interstate closed both ways through there because visibility had dropped to nothing. I want to explain why that name did something to me that it wouldn't have done to anybody else. My dad drove for 31 years, and he died in his truck on that same pull-off, Engine trouble. Sitting there waiting on a tow that took too long. Heart just gave out on him alone in the cab. I was the one who got the call that time too. And I didn't make it before they'd already zipped him into a bag on a gurney by the time I pulled up. So when she said Twin Arrows, it wasn't just a place on the map to me. It felt like the same bad thing finding me twice. I broke every speed law getting out of that pilot lot, and then I hit the wall of it, the actual storm, and there wasn't anything to do but crawl. DPS had barricades up west of Winona, troopers turning trucks around, telling us nobody was getting through until a plow could open a lane. And I sat there for what felt like a year, watching the snow come sideways across my headlights, thinking about my dad's coffee thermos still sitting in a box in my closet, because I never could throw the thing out. When they finally let a line of us follow a plow through, single file, 10 miles an hour, I kept my headlights on his hazards the second I could see them. This little orange pulse, way off in the white. And by the time I got my rig stopped behind his and climbed down into snow up past my knees, I want you to understand, it had been close to 6 hours since his first call. Some of that was the storm, some of that was DPS, and some of that, the front part of it, was me being sore about $40. He was alive. That's the first thing, and I need you to know that before anything else, because for a while I didn't think he would be. His fuel had gelled up on him, cold enough to turn diesel to slush if you're not running the right blend, and once the engine died, the heater went with it. And a sleeper cab loses its warmth fast once that happens. When I got the door open, he was slumped against the driver's seat in 2 coats and a sleeping bag, lips gone, that grayish color, talking slow and a little slurred, but talking, which the paramedics later told me probably saved his life. Staying conscious, staying talking. And what he was talking about, calm as anything, like he was telling me about a layover, was the guy who'd sat with him. He said a man had come by, not too long after his truck died, climbed up into the passenger side, and just sat there with him. Said they talked for hours. Nothing dramatic, nothing that sounded like an emergency conversation. Just talk, the kind 2 drivers make to pass a long haul. Dale said the man kept telling him not to close his eyes, kept asking him questions, kept him answering, kept him there. He said it so plainly, no fear in it at all, that for a second, I thought maybe some other driver really had gotten stuck out there too, and climbed in to wait out the storm with him. And I remember feeling this rush of relief, thinking, good, thank God somebody was with him, and I actually turned around outside the truck to go find whoever it was and thank them myself. There was nothing to find. Snow was still coming down, but it had let up enough that I could see clear around the rig, and there was exactly 1 set of footprints in it, looping from the driver's door around to the front and back. Dale's own boots, from when he'd gotten out earlier to check his fuel filter and set a flare before it got too bad to be outside at all. No second set. No prints from a passenger door that hadn't been shoveled out. No tracks leading off toward a truck of his own. Nothing. 4 inches of fresh snow had come down in the hours since his engine quit, and anything walked into it that recently should have still been sitting right there on top, plain as ink. I didn't say anything to Dale about it right then. I got him wrapped, and got the ambulance flagged when it finally could get through, and it was 2 days later, back home, that I called a friend of mine who works dispatch for DPS, and asked her, straight out, whether any other vehicle had gotten past that closure in the window Dale was talking about. She pulled the log for me. Nothing had moved through there. Not a trooper, not a plow, not another truck. Nobody. From the time the barricades went up until the escort line I'd been part of came through hours later, which meant whoever Dale was describing hadn't driven in, and hadn't walked in either, not without leaving something behind in that snow. It was maybe a week after, Dale out of the hospital, both of us sitting in his kitchen not really talking about it, when he started describing the man a little more, the way you do when something's been sitting in you, and it finally starts coming up in pieces. Red and black flannel, with a busted zipper that wouldn't sit flush, he said, and a beat-up green thermos the guy kept sipping from, and a story he told about taking his boy hunting up near Williams when the kid was maybe 9, a story that ended with the kid falling asleep before they ever got a shot off, and the dad carrying him half a mile back to the truck on his shoulders. I felt my stomach do something I don't have good words for, because that thermos, that jacket, that exact hunting trip, that was my father, not a story like it. That story, the one he used to tell at every Thanksgiving, the one about carrying me back to the truck asleep on his shoulders, after I couldn't stay awake for the last hour of a hunt neither of us ever finished. I asked Dale, careful, whether I'd ever told him that story, ever mentioned the thermos or the jacket, ever said a single word to him about how my dad died on that exact stretch of shoulder. He said no, said he'd have remembered something like that, and I believed him, because I knew I'd never told him. That story was mine, and I'd kept it about as close as I keep anything. The last thing Dale ever said to me about it, before he stopped bringing it up entirely, was that near the end, right before the plow lights showed up through the snow, the man had said something that didn't seem to be part of any conversation, like he was passing along a message rather than making one. Told Dale, "Tell your buddy I wasn't waiting on him." Told him, "Tell your buddy I saw him plenty." Dale didn't know what to make of it, and honestly told me he almost didn't repeat it, because it didn't sound like it was meant for him at all. I haven't been able to decide, in all the times I've turned it over since, whether that was forgiveness or an accusation, whether it was my father telling me he never held the 6 hours against me, or telling me he knew exactly what those 6 hours had been. Dale went back to work about a month later, and not long after that, he asked the company to pair him with a different partner. Never gave me a real reason, just said he thought it'd be good to switch it up, and I let him have that, because I understood it better than he probably realized. We still nod to each other in the yard. We don't talk about Twin Arrows, but I still run that stretch of I-40 for work, still slow down without meaning to, when I pass that exit with the old boarded-up trading post and the 2 big arrows leaning against the sky, and I still find myself checking the shoulder every single time, half hoping and half dreading that I'll see a shape out there in a red and black flannel, like some part of me is still waiting to find out whether I'm looking for proof that nobody was ever there, or looking for a chance to finally say I'm sorry to somebody who already told me he didn't need to hear it. We picked up the reefer load in Barstow a little after 10 that night, produce bound for a distribution center outside Flagstaff, with a hard 5 a.m. appointment, and by the time we cleared Kingman, the sky had gone that flat, starless black you only get up on the plateau in January. Danny had the wheel first. I was in the bunk, trying to get horizontal sleep before my turn, half listening to the tires hum and the heater tick, the way you do after 10 years of team driving, when your body just knows the rhythm of the truck, even when your mind's checked out. Somewhere past Ash Fork, I felt her ease off the pedal for the climb starting, and I came up out of the bunk because that's what you do. You don't leave your partner alone on a grade at night, not when the temperature gauge was already reading 26 and dropping. By Williams, there was snow in the headlights. Not sticking yet, just streaking sideways through the beams like static. Danny had both hands on the wheel, the way she does when the wind starts pushing on the trailer, and I settled into the jump seat with a coffee and watched the mirror out of habit more than anything. That's when I noticed the second set of lights sitting back about 400 feet, holding station in our blind spot's edge, and I didn't think anything of it. Trucks bunch up on this stretch all the time, everybody trying to beat the same window before the grade gets bad. What I did notice, maybe 40 minutes later past Parks, was that the gap hadn't changed. Not once. Not when we passed a slower flatbed and had to ease out. Not when a gust shoved us half a lane wide, and Danny corrected. The other truck did exactly what we did, at exactly the same time we did it, and it never closed the distance, and it never let it open. I watched it through 3 lane changes, and I started doing math I didn't like the answer to. I said something to Danny, low, like it was nothing. "Hey, you clocked the guy behind us." And she glanced up at her mirror and said, "Yeah." She'd noticed 20 minutes ago and figured he was just riding our doors to block the wind off his rig. Which happens. Drivers do that. It's not friendly, but it's not unheard of. So I keyed the CB and threw out a breaker, asked whoever was back there if they wanted to run team, share the grade, standard courtesy. Nothing came back, but a thin hiss that had a rhythm to it I didn't like, almost like it was breathing instead of just being empty air, and I told myself that was tired brain nonsense and let it go. I wanted to know if it was really locked onto us, or if I was imagining a pattern where there wasn't one. So I asked Danny to back off the throttle. Just ease down 5 miles an hour. Nothing dramatic. She did. In the mirror, the lights behind us dropped the exact same 5, almost before her foot was off the pedal. No coasting, no drift. Just there. Matched. Like 2 trucks tied together with a cable you couldn't see. She sped back up. It came back up with her. I've driven next to a lot of trucks in my life, and there's always a half second of human lag in how somebody reacts. A little sway before they correct. There wasn't any lag here. It wasn't reacting to us. It was moving with us. Danny stopped pretending it was nothing right about the time I did. We tried losing it, and I want to be clear, we did this the dumb, obvious way first, not the smart way, because neither of us wanted to admit yet what we were actually testing for. She let a string of 4-wheelers pass, so we had civilian traffic between us and it. It filtered through them the same as we had. She signaled for the pullout up past the runaway ramp sign, the gravel turnout truckers used to chain up, and eased toward it like she meant to take it. In the mirror, the second truck's signal came on too. Its nose started drifting toward the same shoulder a half beat later, and then Danny snapped us back onto the highway without taking the exit, and the other truck straightened out right behind that same instant, like it had known before she finished the move that it was a fake. That's the part that took the fear out of my stomach and put it somewhere colder. It hadn't copied the pullout. It had started to copy it before she'd committed. You can't do that watching a truck. You can only do that if you already know what the driver's about to decide. We got on the radio to a name we both knew, a long-haul regular who runs this lane every week and goes by 6 String, figuring if anybody local had seen weird traffic patterns up this grade, it'd be him. I described it plain. The pacing, the CB silence, the pullout. There was a long stretch of dead air before he came back, longer than it should have taken him to just say he hadn't seen it. And when he did answer, his voice had dropped that easy trucker cadence and gone flat. He told us, don't brake check it. Don't try to shake it again. Just hold your lane and your speed, and let it ride until Bellamont. He said it like he'd said it before, to somebody else, on some other night. I asked him straight out if this had happened to him. He didn't answer that. What he said instead was that there'd been a team rig that went off this grade in a whiteout years back, before either of us was running this route, and that only one of the 2 drivers walked away from it, and that the wreck sat in a yard behind a shop in Williams for the better part of a year before somebody finally scrapped it, because the trucking company it belonged to didn't want it back, and nobody else wanted to buy a rig with that kind of luck attached to it. Danny went quiet after that, in the way she does when she's turning something over that she doesn't like the shape of. A few minutes later, a road light came up over an overpass, one of those tall sodium ones that throw a hard yellow wash across both lanes for a second, and it swept back across our mirrors right as the following truck passed under it. Danny's the one who caught it, not me, because I was watching the road. She said the light hit that windshield clean. No glare, no angle to hide it, and there was nobody sitting behind the wheel. Not an empty cab. She was clear about that when I asked her twice to make sure I understood her right. Somebody was there. They just weren't sitting like somebody drives. I want to tell you we panicked, but what actually happens in that kind of hour is you go very still and very careful, because panic on a mountain grade in snow gets people killed for reasons that have nothing to do with what's behind you. So we just drove. And that's when the last thing happened before Bellamont that neither of us has fully made peace with, because up until then, everything had scared us. And this didn't. Not right away. There's a curve about a mile out from the Bellamont exit where the road doglegs left around a rock cut, and black ice collects there in a shadow that never gets sun even at noon. Danny didn't know that curve. I did, from running it years back with a different company, and I was already leaning forward to warn her when the truck behind us flashed its high beams twice, fast, the old trucker signal for slow down, trouble ahead, and Danny eased off without even asking why. We came around that dogleg doing maybe 40 instead of 55, and the trailer still slid half a foot on the ice before the tires bit again. 55 would have put us into the rock. Neither of us said anything for a while after that. It's a strange thing to be grateful to something that's been terrifying you for 60 miles straight. We came down the last grade into the Belmont exit, doing the speed we'd been holding the whole way, and I watched the mirror the way you'd watch a held breath. And at the exact second our front bumper passed the exit sign, the lights behind us were gone. Not merged off. Not fallen back into the dark where I'd lose them naturally. Gone. Between one blink and the next. Off every mirror on the truck at once. The way a picture disappears when you turn off a screen. The CB, which had been holding that same thin breathing hiss the entire drive, cracked once. Clean. And a voice that wasn't 6 strings, and wasn't anybody's we knew, read back our unit number and our load number, correct down to the digit, and then went dead air for good. We didn't talk about it much on the rest of the drive into the yard. Danny called it in to dispatch as a rough patch of black ice near Belmont, which was true, and left it at that, because there's no box on a company incident report for what actually happened, and neither of us wanted to be the driver who filled one out trying. It might have stayed just our story, the kind you tell once at a truck stop counter and then let go of. Except 3 months later we were parked at a fuel island outside Kingman and got to talking with a young team we didn't know. And somewhere in the small talk the woman mentioned they'd run the Belmont grade the week before at night for the first time and picked up a tail that rode their exact pace for almost an hour, never closing, gone the second they hit the Belmont exit, and she described our rig back to us without knowing it. Same unit number scheme, same trailer color, same way it flashed its brights once, before a curve she hadn't known was icy. Danny didn't say anything to correct her. Neither did I. We just paid for our fuel and got back on the road, and since that night, we've made it a rule between us that whichever one of us is running solo when the dispatch board puts that lane up after dark, we push it to the other driver, or we push it to the morning, because whatever is riding that grade, we're no longer sure which side of the mirror we're on, and we don't run it together after dark anymore. I need every one of you running the 40 through northern Arizona to hear this straight, because I've said it on 2 forums and half of Channel 19 between Kingman and Gallup, and I'm done being polite about it. Do not park overnight at that rest area past Parks, the one tucked back against the tree line before you hit Williams. I don't care how tired your eyes are, or how close you are to running out of clock. Find a truck stop. Pay for the shower you don't need. Do whatever it takes. I'm going to tell you exactly why, in order, because the order is the part that matters. I've run that lane for going on 6 years, hauling for the same outfit, same general route. Southern California up through Flagstaff and out toward Albuquerque. That rest area past Parks was always my spot. Pines right up to the edge of the lot. Picnic tables nobody uses after October. A vault toilet that never has paper. And just enough distance between trucks that you can actually sleep without some reefer unit 2 spots over, running all night into your dreams. I probably stopped there 30-40 times over the years, without a single thing to say about it. Then last spring, I started noticing a guy standing at the tree line, not walking a dog, not smoking, not stretching his legs after 11 hours in the seat like the rest of us do, just standing there, facing the lot. First time I clocked him, I figured he was a driver from one of the other trucks, out getting air, and I went back to my log and forgot about it inside of a minute. You see people at rest areas. That's the whole point of a rest area. Second time was maybe 5 weeks later. Different load, different truck configuration, but same stop, because that's where my hours ran out. And there he was again. Same tree line, same rough spot, near that broken sapling that never grew straight. I want to be clear. I wasn't looking for him. I just happened to glance up from checking my mirrors, and there he was. And something about him not moving the entire 20 minutes I was out there doing my walk-around caught in my head wrong. Guys shift their weight. They check their phones. They pace. This guy stood like a fence post, and I remember thinking, that's a long time to stand still in the cold for no reason. That's when I started actually paying attention, and that's when things stopped adding up. A driver named Coop was parked next to me that same night. Dry van, older guy, been doing this longer than I have. I pointed it out to him, kind of laughing, said something like, "Your buddy over there's been standing in one spot since I got here. Is he lost?" Coop looked exactly where I was pointing. looked for a good 10 seconds, told me there wasn't anybody there, just trees, and asked if I'd been popping something to stay awake that I shouldn't have been. I laughed it off, because what else are you going to do? But I looked back, and the guy was still standing right where I'd been looking. The whole time, Coop was looking at nothing. I've got a dash cam, road-facing and cab-facing both. And after that night with Coop, I started digging through the footage every time I stopped there, hoping I'd catch something I could point at and say, "See? I'm not losing it. Nothing. Not one frame." Whatever that camera picks up in the dark, and it picks up plenty, it never once caught him standing there, not even as a smudge or a shadow that didn't belong. I know what I saw with my own eyes, though, close enough to describe the guy's jacket, and having a camera tell me different than my own memory is its own kind of unsettling that I wasn't ready for. Now, here's the part that really started working on me. My dispatch doesn't run a fixed schedule. One week I'm hauling out of Ontario. Next week it's a drop in Barstow. Sometimes I don't even know I'm taking the 40 corridor until the day before. There's no reason that rest area should show up on my route more than any other pull-off between California and New Mexico. But every single time dispatch routed me through there, whether I picked the stop on purpose or just ran out of hours near it, he was there waiting, like it didn't matter what changed on my end. Like the stop was fixed on his side, no matter what shuffled on mine. Around trip 4 or 5, I started doing something stupid, and I'll admit it was stupid. But I started pacing off the distance between the tree line and the edge of the lot every time I stopped, using the light pole and the second picnic table as markers. First time I bothered to measure, best I could tell, he was standing close to 100 yards back, right at the tree line where the ground starts getting soft. Next trip, it was more like 70. The one after that, I didn't even need the light pole to tell, because he'd crossed the tree line entirely and was standing in the open grass between the pines and the gravel shoulder. I started asking around after that, because I needed to know if I was the only one. And here's where it got worse instead of better. An old dispatcher I know from way back, retired now, mentioned offhand that a driver went missing off that same stretch of highway a long time before I ever started running it. Truck found sitting in that same rest area, engine off, door hanging open, driver's personal stuff still inside, wallet, phone, everything except the man himself. Never turned up. It got a couple lines in a local paper and then just stopped being a story, the way those things do out in the middle of nowhere, where nobody's watching close enough to keep asking questions. I posted about all of this on one of the trucking forums, mostly to see if I'd get called crazy, and I got something worse than that. A guy who's been off the road for years replied and said he ran that exact lane for the same company I drive for, way back before I started, and he stopped taking graveyard freight through that section entirely after something happened to him out there that he still won't fully describe in writing. He said the same thing I'd been noticing, that it gets closer every trip, and he said the reason he quit that route wasn't the money or the hours. It was that he didn't want to find out what happens once it stops being far away. So I tried to outsmart it. I started varying my stop times on purpose, pushing my brakes earlier or later, using a different rest area a few exits down whenever I had the hours to spare, trying to throw off whatever pattern was letting this thing know when I'd show up. For a couple of runs, it actually worked, or at least I told myself it did, because I avoided that lot completely and slept fine at a truck stop outside Williams instead. Then a storm rolled through. Chain law got called on the pass, and I got boxed into that exact rest area because it was the only legal, safe place to stop before my clock ran out. I want you to understand, I did everything right that night, followed every rule, and he was already closer than the math should have allowed, closer than the worst trip before, like it hadn't needed me to show up on schedule at all, like it had been standing there the whole time, closing the gap on its own clock, waiting for me to run out of road. That same week, I finally got something on camera, and it wasn't what I expected. Not him walking, not him standing, just one frame, one single frame, out of thousands, where the light off my marker lamps caught something at the edge of the tree line, clear enough to make out a jacket, company jacket, our company. Except it was the old patch, the one they stopped issuing before I even hired on. Retired style, different color scheme entirely. I sat in my cab at 2 in the morning, staring at that one frame, until my eyes burned. Because there's only one way a jacket like that ends up standing at a tree line in the dark, and it isn't a coincidence. The last time I stopped there, I want to walk you through exactly what happened, because this is the part I need every one of you to actually hear. I pulled in, did my paperwork, started my 10-hour like I'm required to, and I made myself sit through it, because I've got bills same as you, and I can't afford a log violation over something I can't prove to anybody. I looked up maybe 40 minutes in, and he was standing at the edge of the lot. Not the tree line anymore, the actual edge of the pavement. Close enough that streetlight was hitting him instead of just moon. And I want to be honest with you, he wasn't walking. I never once saw him take a step. I'd look away to check something in the cab, look back, and he'd just be nearer, like the space between us had folded up while I wasn't watching. Close enough that last time that I could see, he was standing exactly the way I stand when I'm doing my own walk-around, arms loose, head tilted the same angle I hold mine. I broke my brake, started the truck, pulled out with maybe 6 hours logged instead of 10, and drove tired and scared all the way into Flagstaff on a truck stop parking lot floodlight, which I know is against everything I'm supposed to do, and I'd do it again. I came home and I told my wife some version of this that left out the worst parts, because what was I going to say? I got on every forum I run with and I told the real version, because you all deserve the real version. And I figured I'd get some pushback from guys thinking I was making it up for attention. Instead, I started getting messages from other drivers running that same corridor. Different rest stops, Ash Fork, one outside Seligman, all saying some version of the same thing this season. A shape at the tree line that doesn't act like a person and doesn't sit still on camera and gets a little closer every single time they stop. It isn't just my lot. It isn't just me. Whatever this is, it's working more than one driver at once, and none of us know what it's counting toward. I haven't taken that lane in 2 months. Rerouted myself onto a lane running through Colorado instead. Told dispatch I'd take the pay cut. Didn't care. Figured distance would handle what avoiding the spot itself couldn't. 3 weeks ago, I stopped at a truck stop outside Trinidad. Nowhere near Arizona. Nowhere near pine trees. Or that stretch of the 40. Just a regular lot with sodium lights and a diner attached. Went out to check my straps before I turned in. And out past the fence line, right at the edge of where the light gives up, there was somebody standing still, facing my truck. Same stance. Same distance I remember clocking that very first month outside Williams, before I knew to be scared of it. So don't tell me it's about the rest area. I used to think if I just stopped stopping there, I'd be done with it. And I am telling every one of you listening right now that I don't believe that anymore. I think it clocked me the first night I stood in that lot and didn't think twice about a man standing too still at a tree line, and I think the place was never really the point. I think it's coming closer every time, regardless of where I park, and the only thing that changed by running is that now I don't know which lot it'll be standing at next, and neither will you. 14 years is long enough to stop counting the days and start counting the seasons instead. Long enough that I don't reach for the phone every time it rings after 10 at night. Almost long enough. But I still keep his CB handle taped inside the kitchen cabinet, above the mugs, where I see it every morning. Dry wash, that's what the other drivers called him, on account of a joke about a wash he'd gotten his rig stuck in outside Barstow back before we were married. Ray Hutchins drove for 22 years before that last night. And for the first 8 of those years, I fell asleep to the sound of his voice on the phone, telling me about the road. And for the last 14, I've fallen asleep trying to remember exactly how that voice sounded before it stopped. We had a routine, the kind you don't notice you have until it's gone. He'd call around 9 most nights, wherever he was, just to talk while he ate whatever he'd picked up at whatever truck stop he was parked at. That night, he called from somewhere past Seligman, heading east on 40, and right away I could tell something was different, because he wasn't talking about the road, he was talking about the car behind him. Said there'd been a sedan sitting on his bumper since Seligman, not passing, not falling back, just sitting there in his mirrors, mile after mile, and he'd slowed down twice to let it go around, and it hadn't gone around. He wasn't panicked. That's the detail that stayed lodged in me all these years, how level his voice was. He said he was going to pull off in Ash Fork. There was a lot there that used to be a truck stop before it shut down, and he'd sit tight until it passed, or until he felt right about moving again. He said, "I'll call you back in 20 minutes, don't worry." And then there was a sound, not a crash, not a shout, just a kind of soft interruption, like someone had set the phone down on a seat, and then the line went dead. I called back 4 times before I called the highway patrol. They found his rig around 2 in the morning, backed into a stall at that closed lot outside Ash Fork. And for years, the detail that undid me wasn't that he was gone, it was how the truck looked. It wasn't skewed across 2 spots, like a man had jumped out in a hurry. It was backed in clean, trailer square, with the lines that had faded into the gravel, the way he always parked, the way he'd been parking rigs for 2 decades. The keys were still in the ignition. His logbook was on the seat. His coffee thermos was still warm when the first deputy touched it. Nothing was missing, except him. And that detail sat wrong with me from the very first night, because I knew my husband, and a man running from someone doesn't take the time to square up his trailer first. It was almost 3 weeks before the detective mentioned, almost like an afterthought, that Ray's phone showed a second call that night. Not to me. A call placed less than a minute after ours had cut off, to a number I didn't recognize, one that wasn't in any contact list. Not a dispatcher, not the shop, not anyone I'd ever heard him mention in 15 years of marriage. I remember sitting in that detective's office thinking, absurdly, that maybe he'd called another woman, and hating myself for thinking it, and then hating the detective a little for not telling me sooner. It took the phone company almost 2 months to trace that number, and when they did, it wasn't a person's line at all. It was a payphone, bolted to the wall outside a truck stop in New Mexico, the kind that mostly exist now, just so truckers on dead zones can still make a call. The odd part wasn't that it was a payphone. The odd part was that the same payphone had been called from Ray's cell twice before, both times months earlier, both times late at night, both times for less than a minute. Ray had never once mentioned a stop in that town. I went through 6 years of fuel receipts to find those dates, and both times the receipts showed him 300 miles away. That's what sent me into his logbooks myself, since the investigators had already combed through them once and called it nothing. But nothing looks like nothing until you know what you're hunting for. I found a pattern going back almost a year before he disappeared. The same exit off 40 near Winslow, roughly the same week of the month, an hour or 2 unaccounted for, that didn't match any run sheet Cactus Line had on file. He'd never once mentioned Winslow to me, outside of the ordinary way you'd mention any town you pass through. I sat at our kitchen table with his handwriting in front of me, the same handwriting that used to sign birthday cards, and I felt for the first time like I was looking at a stranger's calendar. It was a woman named Carol who finally explained it, and she reached out to me almost a year after he vanished, having gotten my number from someone at the carrier. She ran the loss prevention line for a cargo insurer that covered several outfits working that stretch of 40, and she told me, carefully, like she'd rehearsed it, that Ray had called that tip line himself almost a year before he disappeared, from a payphone, to report that he'd watched a load get swapped at a lumping dock outside Winslow, pallets of consumer electronics going out one door and coming back as something else on the manifest. He hadn't wanted his name on it. He'd asked, apparently, for someone to call him back on a number that wasn't traceable to his own phone, and somebody had. A man who told him he was a regional investigator working the case, who told Ray to keep his eyes open and to call that direct line, not 911, not dispatch, if he ever felt like he was being watched on the road. My husband, who I'd thought was keeping something from me out of guilt, had been keeping something from me to keep me out of it. For a long while after that, the case went quiet the way cases do. Not closed, just cold. Filed under a word I've come to despise, unresolved. Cody grew up mostly without his father telling him how to back a trailer or check a brake line, though a few of Ray's old CB friends took him under wing at truck shows now and then, out of a kind of loyalty I never asked for and never stopped being grateful for. Every year or two, someone would call me, always a trucker, always a stranger, saying they'd heard Ray on the radio once, years back, and just wanted me to know he was thought of. Mostly those calls were comfort, dressed up as information, and I learned to take them as comfort, and nothing more. Except for one, about 5 years in, from a driver named Purdy who ran the same corridor regularly. He said he'd been on Channel 19 that same night, hours after Ray's rig was already sitting cold in that lot, according to the official timeline, and he swore he heard dry wash key up. Just a few words. Something about waiting on a callback. Gone before anyone could answer him. Purdy wasn't the type to make things up for attention, and when I told the detective, he checked it against tower logs and couldn't rule it out or confirm it, which is its own kind of torment, a maybe that never resolves. It meant either Purdy was wrong, or my husband had still been alive, and near a radio, well past the hour we'd all agreed he'd gone quiet. Then, 3 years after that, a second driver called from clear out in Oklahoma, someone who'd never known Ray personally, but had heard the story secondhand at a truck stop counter, and mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd heard the handle dry wash on the air a few months after the disappearance, somewhere past Amarillo, a voice that didn't sound like the man everyone described. At the time, I told myself handles get reused, that CB culture was loose enough that some other driver had just picked up an old name he liked the sound of. It wasn't until much later I understood how deliberately wrong that explanation was. The break, when it finally came, didn't come from anything I did. It came from a journalist working cold cases for a regional paper, a woman who'd been quietly building a file on missing long-haul drivers along the 40 corridor, going back almost 15 years. And she called me, because Ray's case matched a pattern she'd found in 4 other disappearances. All owner-operators. All vanished from rigs that were later found parked properly. Nothing stolen. No struggle. No leads. It wasn't one man's grief anymore. It was a shape. And once I saw the shape, I couldn't unsee it. What tied those cases together, when she laid them out for me, wasn't just the empty trucks. It was that in at least 3 of them, including ours, the driver had mentioned in a final call or a message home that he thought he was being followed by something official-looking, a plain white truck or pickup with markings that read like a safety inspection unit, never anything anyone could later confirm belonged to any real agency. Men who spend their lives getting waved into way stations don't think twice about a vehicle that looks like it has the right to pull them over. That single detail rearranged everything I thought I understood about that night. My husband hadn't been running from the car that followed him from Seligman. He'd been waiting, calmly, properly parked, for someone he believed was coming to help. It took the journalist and a retired detective almost 2 more years to get anyone in Ash Fork to talk. And when someone finally did, it was an old woman who used to run the register at a diner near that lot, long since closed herself, who'd moved away from town not long after Ray disappeared, and had spent all these years assuming what she'd seen didn't matter. She remembered a plain service truck idling at that lot some nights, going back months before Ray ever went missing, always around the same hours. And she remembered, faintly, a man behind the wheel who used to come into the diner sometimes for coffee, polite, unremarkable, the kind of face you'd forget on purpose, because there was nothing in it to hold on to. She gave them a description good enough to run against old employment records for a defunct cargo security consulting outfit that had operated out of Flagstaff for a few years, before quietly folding, after some kind of internal falling out nobody had bothered to investigate at the time. A name came back, Frank Mercer. Mercer had died 6 years earlier, a heart attack in a motel room outside Barstow, alone, no next of kin listed, no note, nothing that had ever connected him to a missing trucker 3 states away, until his old phone records were finally cross-checked against a burner line tied to a payphone in New Mexico. There was no trial, there was no confession, no moment where anyone looked him in the eye and made him answer for it. Just paperwork, old and thin, confirming that the man my husband had trusted to protect him from whatever was following him that night had been part of the very thing that took him. Remains were eventually recovered on a piece of land outside Winslow that had once belonged to Mercer's family, and the coroner's office matched them to Ray within the year. Quiet devastation isn't a phrase I ever used before all this, but it's the only one that fits what it felt like to finally bury a man I'd already spent 14 years missing. The last of it came in a box. The sheriff's office finally released to me, once the case closed. Personal effects that had sat in evidence storage since that first night. Mostly things I already knew. His wallet, his reading glasses, the little spiral notebook he kept tucked behind the visor for mile markers and load notes. I hadn't looked through that notebook in years, not since the first investigators handed it back to me the first time and told me there was nothing useful in it. But I sat with it one evening, long after the case had already closed, long after Mercer was already 6 years dead, and near the bottom of a page dated almost a year before he disappeared, in handwriting so small I nearly missed it, squeezed into the margin like an afterthought he didn't want anyone to notice unless they were looking hard enough. He'd written a plate number, and beside it, 4 words. If anything happens, Mercer. He'd known, or at least suspected, a year before that night in Ash Fork, that the man on the other end of that line might not be who he said he was. He'd written it down anyway, small and careful, the way you leave a light on for someone you're not sure will ever come looking. Nobody had thought to look in a work notebook for a message meant for the people he loved, not the first time through it, not for 14 years. It had been sitting in a cardboard box the whole time, closer than any of the calls or the tips or the pattern the journalist finally put together. And it had been waiting there, patient as he ever was, for someone to finally turn the right page. I was hauling a partial load of restaurant equipment out of Barstow, headed for Albuquerque, taking the long stretch of 40 through Seligman, because the interstate had a pileup near Kingman that morning, and dispatch rerouted me onto the old road for a few miles before I could cut back. It was maybe 2 in the afternoon, that flat white heat where the asphalt shimmers, and you stop trusting your own eyes about a mile out. I saw the orange cones first, then the sign, hand-lettered almost, propped against a sawhorse. Way station open. All trucks must enter. I'd run that corridor a dozen times over the years and never once seen that particular station staffed. It usually sat dark, gate up, like it had given up on itself. I didn't think much of it. Stations open and close on schedules nobody tells you about. I signaled and pulled in. The man who came out to meet me wasn't wearing a full DPS uniform. Not the kind I was used to seeing. No name tape that I could make out. Just a reflective vest over a plain shirt, like he'd been pulled off some other job that morning and handed a clipboard. He had me roll down, and instead of asking for the usual bill of lading, logbook, current hours, he leaned into the window a little and asked where I was sleeping that night. Not where I was headed, where I was sleeping. I told him I hadn't decided yet, somewhere past Flagstaff probably, and he nodded, like that answer mattered to him in a way it shouldn't have. Then he asked if anybody back home would be expecting a call from me. I said my wife usually waited up. He wrote something down, though I never saw what, and asked one more thing, whether I ran this route alone most weeks, or if I ever had someone riding with me. I told him I always ran alone. He nodded again, slower this time, and handed me the clipboard to sign. The form wasn't like any inspection sheet I'd signed before. No station number printed at the top. Just a blank line somebody had filled in by hand, with numbers that didn't match the mile marker I could see through the windshield. There was a line near the bottom I didn't recognize, something about a transfer notation, left empty. I remember thinking it was strange, the way you notice a stranger's shoes don't match the rest of their outfit. A flicker of attention that doesn't rise to the level of doing anything about it. I had 400 miles left and a delivery window closing on me, so I signed where he pointed. He tore off a carbon copy and handed it back, and that was it. No walk-around of the trailer, no check of the axle weights. He just stepped back and waved me through, like I'd passed something. I pulled out onto the highway and caught the station in my side mirror for a second, and it struck me that the lights inside the little block building were off. I told myself it was just glare, midday sun on glass, and kept driving. It wasn't until I was almost to Flagstaff, replaying the stop out of boredom the way you do on a long, empty stretch, that I realized the whole time I'd been sitting there, I never heard a radio. No chatter, no dispatch calls, nothing crackling on his belt. Every DPS stop I'd ever pulled had that low hum of a radio going somewhere in the background. This one had been dead quiet, just him and me, and the sound of my own engine idling. I shrugged it off. You spend enough hours alone in a cab, your mind starts inventing texture where there isn't any. Then I didn't think about Seligman again for close to 4 months. It came back to me because of a letter, one of those routine-looking envelopes from my carrier's safety department, the kind that usually means somebody in payroll made a typo. This one said, my file had come up for a compliance review after a flagged roadside inspection, and could I confirm the details of a stop recorded on that date? I remembered the date the second I saw it, because I remembered the heat and the cones and the man leaning into my window asking about my wife waiting up. I called the safety office to clear it up quick, figuring it was nothing, and the woman on the phone read off the station code listed on my file. It wasn't Seligman's code. It was a station 2 states away, out past the Texas Panhandle, one I had never in my life pulled into. I told her that had to be a mistake, that I signed that paperwork in Arizona, not Texas, and she said she was just going off what was scanned into the system. She offered to pull the actual document and email it to me, and when it came through that evening, I sat in a truck stop parking lot outside Gallup and stared at it for a long time. It was my signature, my license number, correct down to the last digit, but underneath the box for home address, somebody had written down my mother's old place in Bakersfield, a house I hadn't lived in or listed anywhere in 15 years, not on my CDL, not on any form the company had on file. I never gave anyone that address. Not that day, not ever. Not to a man asking about dinner plans and who waits up for me at night. I called Arizona DPS directly the next morning, thinking maybe there was some clerical crossover, a shared database glitch, something a supervisor could explain in 30 seconds, and I could stop turning it over in my head. The dispatcher I got put me on hold for a long time, and when she came back, she said there was no inspection on record under my name or plate for that date at that station, or at any station in the state that week. I told her I had a signed copy sitting on the seat next to me. She said that was strange because, according to the maintenance log she was reading off, that particular scale house had been shut down that entire day for a resurfacing job on the approach ramp. Closed before sunrise, barricades up, no personnel assigned, nobody scheduled to be anywhere near it until the following Monday. I sat there with the phone against my ear for a good 10 seconds, not saying anything, running back through the memory, the cones, the sign propped on the sawhorse, the man's reflective vest, trying to find the seam where reality and paperwork had come apart. She asked if I wanted to file a complaint, and I said I'd think about it, because at that point, I didn't know what I was complaining about. A stop that happened but officially didn't. A form that existed, but 2 states from where I signed it. Questions about my sleeping arrangements that had nothing to do with an axle weight, answered honestly, now sitting somewhere in a system with an address I hadn't used since my 20s, attached to my name. I brought it up with a couple of drivers I trust, guys I'd known for years off the same dispatch board, mostly to see if I sounded as unhinged out loud as I felt in my own head. One of them, an older guy, who's run the Southwest Corridor longer than I've had my license, went quiet for a second, and then told me almost the same thing had happened to him, years back, outside a station near Kingman that was supposed to be decommissioned. Different man, he said, but the same kind of questions. Not about the load, about whether anyone would notice if he didn't check in that night. He'd signed something too, and when he tried to follow up later, the paperwork had turned up filed somewhere he'd never been. He said he stopped thinking about it after a while because there was nowhere left to push. No agency would own it. No name to attach to a complaint. Just a folder somewhere with his information sitting next to a stranger's handwriting. I pulled my dash cam footage that night, going back through the archive on my laptop, because I run one on every trip out of habit, and the clip from that stretch outside Seligman was there, time-stamped, everything before and after intact, except for the 11 minutes I was actually stopped, which had corrupted into a gray flicker of nothing. No audio, no picture, just noise. Every other file on that card, months of driving, opened clean. Just that one window, gone. I kept the printed copy of that form in the glove box after that. folded into my logbook, and I told myself I'd let it go, because there was nothing left to do with it that wouldn't make me sound like a man who'd been alone in a cab too long. But I still run that stretch of 40 a few times a year, and I still slow down every time I pass that little block building outside Seligman, chained shut now, weeds working up through the cracked apron where the trucks used to idle. It's been closed, officially, for going on 2 years. About 3 weeks ago, my phone rang from a number with no area code I recognized, blocked caller ID, somewhere around 11 at night, while I was parked at a rest stop outside Amarillo. I picked up out of habit. Nobody said anything for a second, just breathing and road noise, like someone was standing outside in wind, and then a voice, flat, unhurried, asked me if anybody back home was expecting a call from me that night. Same words, same order. I didn't answer. I just sat there with the phone against my ear in the dark, engine ticking as it cooled, and after a few seconds the line went dead. No click, no dial tone, just silence, where a connection should have ended, and didn't quite. I never found out who it was. I never will, probably. I just know I still check that mirror every time I pass Seligman, and some nights I still wonder who's got that answer written down somewhere, filed under my name, 2 states from where I gave it. I used to be the one who ruined ghost stories for everybody on the crew. Somebody would bring up the grade between Seligman and Kingman, that long stretch of 2-lane and old 66 pavement, where the cell bars disappear and the radio hisses more than it talks, and they'd start in on the woman who flags you down near Truxton, or the brake lights that show up in your mirror on a road where nobody's behind you. I'd cut them off every time. 14 years hauling freight teaches you that tired eyes and dead batteries explain almost everything people call unexplainable. I said it so often the guys started doing my voice for me, before I could say it myself. Then Wren went quiet out there one night, and she never came back on the radio, and I haven't laughed at one of those stories since. Wren was Renata Cole, and she drove for the same small outfit I did, hauling dry van freight between Flagstaff and the Vegas corridor. We weren't best friends in some movie way. We were co-workers who happened to like each other, who ran the same lanes often enough that we'd hop on Channel 19 just to have somebody to talk to on the long empty parts. She teased me about being the crew's designated killjoy. She used to say she halfway believed the stories herself, not because she'd seen anything, but because she liked the idea that the desert kept a few secrets from people like us, who thought we'd seen everything. I told her that was a nice way of saying she was gullible. She told me that was a nice way of saying I was scared. We left it there, the way you do. The night it happened, she was running that grade westbound, late, maybe 11 at night, hauling a load that had her behind schedule, after a scale delay outside Seligman. I know the timeline, because I still have it memorized, which tells you something about what this did to me. She keyed up around mile marker 106 to complain about a headache from squinting at low sun all afternoon, and I told her to pull the next wide shoulder and walk it off for 10 minutes, and she laughed and said she'd rather just get to Kingman and sleep it off in a real bed. That was the last thing she said to me. Not scared, not urgent, just tired and a little short, exactly like every other night we'd talked on that radio for 3 years. I tried to raise her again 40 minutes later, when I hadn't heard her check in at the usual spot, and I got nothing back but the flat hiss you get out there when there's nobody transmitting on the other end at all. They found her rig 11 hours later, nosed onto the shoulder, just past that same marker, hazards still blinking, engine still running on idle. That's the detail that undid me first, before anything else did. The cab was locked from the outside. Her phone was on the passenger seat, at 40% charge, and there was coffee in her travel mug that the trooper on scene said still had warmth left in it when they got there that morning. Nothing was torn. Nothing was broken. Her logbook, the electronic one tied straight to the engine, showed her on duty and driving right up until the exact minute the truck stopped moving at that exact mile marker, and then nothing after, like somebody had reached out and turned her off, rather than anything happening to her. No skid marks, no blood, no sign a single thing had gone wrong, except that the driver simply wasn't there anymore. A wreck I could have understood, an animal in the road, a heart attack, a mechanical failure. Any of it would have made sense to me, as a trucker who's seen the ugly, ordinary ways this job kills people. This didn't look like any of those. It looked staged for calm, like whatever took her wanted the scene to say, nothing happened here at all. The second thing that changed how I understood it came about 2 weeks later, when a trooper I'd gotten friendly with during the search let something slip he probably shouldn't have. I'd asked him straight out if they had any theory at all, and he got quiet, in a way cops don't usually get quiet. And then he said I wasn't the first person to sit in that office, asking him about that stretch of road. He didn't elaborate, and when I pushed, he backed off and gave me the standard line about an active investigation, but the damage was done. Up until that moment, I'd been treating Wren's disappearance as a singular, isolated horror, a lightning strike, the kind of thing that happens once and ruins one family and one crew, and then the world moves on. That sentence told me it wasn't singular. It told me there was a file somewhere with other names in it, and that whoever kept that file wasn't in a hurry to make it public. So I went looking, because sitting still with that sentence in my head was worse than anything I might find. I spent my days off at the library in Kingman, going through old newspaper archives on microfilm, and I bought a lot of coffee for retired drivers at a diner outside Seligman, who remembered things dispatch offices never wrote down. What I found wasn't a ghost story. It was a pattern, spread across almost 30 years, of solo long-haul drivers, most of them women, a few men, going quiet on that same handful of mile markers, with almost identical circumstances every time. Vehicle found intact. No struggle, personal effects untouched. Most were filed as voluntary disappearances within a year, which conveniently closes the case and closes the liability, because a grown adult who chooses to walk away from her life isn't anybody's fault. One old-timer told me flat out that dispatchers used to reroute new drivers around that grade at night without ever telling them why, just so nobody asked questions the company didn't want to answer. The stories the crew laughed about for years weren't superstition invented out of boredom. They were the only version of the truth anybody was allowed to pass along out loud. I couldn't leave it at research after that. About 4 months after Wren disappeared, I asked dispatch to put me on that exact lane, that exact grade, at night, and they were reluctant enough that I had to push, which told me something too. I drove it the way she would have, same speed, same radio channel, and somewhere past Truxton, right as my odometer clicked toward that marker, channel 19, crackled with a check-in. 3 words. The same 3 words Wren always used to sign off with when she was tired and didn't want to keep talking. I keyed up to answer without even thinking, heart going hard enough that I could hear it over the engine, and I got nothing back. Just hiss, then silence, like the channel had been open, and then wasn't. I told myself for a long time it was skip, radio waves bouncing off atmosphere from some trucker 4 states away, using the same tired phrase everybody in this business uses. I mostly believe that. I keep circling back to it anyway. 2 weeks after that same run, I stopped at that shoulder in daylight and found her spare keychain sitting in the gravel, the little enamel one shaped like a cactus that she kept on her extra set, in condition too clean for something that had supposedly been sitting exposed to 2 Arizona summers. Somebody had put it there recently. Somebody had been back. The break that actually mattered came almost 3 years in, when the case got reassigned to a detective willing to push for lab work the department hadn't bothered with the first time. They pulled trace off the wheel and door handle of Wren's cab that had been sitting in evidence untouched, and they found a partial that wasn't hers, wasn't in any local database, and by itself would have gone nowhere. What made it matter was a national system flag, connecting it to unresolved trace, from 2 other cases along that same long-haul corridor, one in New Mexico, one clear out past Barstow, both women, both solo drivers, both found the same way Wren was found. Engine running, nothing broken, nobody there. That's when the shape of it changed one more time in my head, from a road that swallows people to a person who moves with the freight, someone who knows truck stops and dispatch schedules and dead radio zones the way only somebody inside this life would know them. Not a curse on a stretch of highway. A man, most likely, working the same lanes the rest of us work, blending into the exact community that keeps telling itself, these are just stories. The case is still open. Nobody's been arrested. I still run freight, because it's the only work I know how to do. But I don't run that great at night, without somebody staying on the line with me the whole way through. And I keep a photo of Ren, clipped above my visor, where I used to keep nothing at all. Last month, a new driver on our crew brought up the woman on the shoulder near Truxton the way we all used to, laughing, waiting for somebody to roll their eyes and shut it down the way I always did. I didn't laugh. I told her to keep her radio on and her eyes on the road past that marker, and I didn't explain why. Because some things you can't make land in a joking conversation at a truck stop. 2 nights after that, on the anniversary of the night Ren went quiet, I was running that same stretch alone, and Channel 19 gave me 3 words in her old cadence. Close and clean. Nothing like distant skip ever sounds. I keyed up. Nobody answered. I don't know what took my friend off that road, and I've stopped pretending I need a name for it before I'll believe it's real. I just know I don't dismiss a story anymore. Not that one. Not any of the ones the old guys used to tell. Because somewhere out past Seligman, there's a mile marker that doesn't care whether you believe in it, and it's still taking people. People ask me why I don't crack my curtain at that lot outside Kingman anymore, and I always give them the joke answer first, because the real answer takes longer, and it makes people uncomfortable in a way that a joke doesn't. The joke answer is that Arizona wildlife has opinions about truckers, and I'd rather not hear them. That usually gets a laugh at the counter. The real answer is longer, and I've only told it start to finish maybe 3 times, and every time I tell it, I notice I'm gripping my coffee a little tighter by the end. It started as the most boring kind of trouble there is. I was running a load east, nothing special, and about 40 miles out from Kingman my dash lit up like a Christmas tree, and the truck started losing power on the grade. I limped it into a truck stop off I-40, one of those big gravel and asphalt lots with the sodium lights on poles too far apart to actually light anything, and a mechanic on the phone told me it was a sensor that had to come from Phoenix. Overnight, maybe into the next afternoon. I've heard that sentence probably 200 times in this job, and it never once ruined my night. You shrug, you back into a spot, you make yourself a bad dinner out of the fridge under the bunk, and you sleep it off. Breakdowns are just Tuesday. So I backed into a spot at the edge of the lot, away from the idling reefers because I wanted quiet. And that decision is the first one I'd take back if I could. The first turn in the night came around 1 in the morning. And it wasn't dramatic. That's what I want people to understand. It was gravel. Just the sound of something walking on gravel outside, slow, out past the passenger side. My first thought wasn't fear. It was annoyance. Because I figured it was a dog somebody let loose from one of the other cabs. Or a coyote nosing around for food trash. I've fallen asleep to coyotes plenty of nights. They yip, they squabble, they move in a pack, and you hear 3 or 4 sets of feet, overlapping, quick and light, here and gone. This wasn't that. This was one set of steps, heavy enough that I could feel it more than hear it, through 18 tons of truck, and it didn't come and go. It went around. I lay there in the bunk, and I actually started counting. Because counting is what I do instead of panicking, and I counted the same number of steps on the far side as I did close in. Like whatever it was had a lap it was running, and it kept the lap exact. Coyotes don't pace like that. Coyotes don't do laps. I told myself, out loud, in my empty cab, that I was tired and paranoid, and that the human brain is a pattern-finding machine that'll invent a marching band out of static if you give it enough dark and enough silence. That's true, for the record. It just didn't happen to be what was going on. The second turn came about 20 minutes later, when I finally gave in and cracked the curtain to look, because not looking had started to feel worse than looking. The lot lights threw everything in that flat orange that makes color pointless, and at first I didn't see anything, and I was already halfway into a joke about scaring myself over nothing. Then the shadow hit the side of my trailer. Not an animal-shaped shadow low to the ground, a shadow that came up the aluminum skin of that trailer to about the height of my own mirror, which sits a good 5.5 feet up, and it held there a second, before it slid off into the dark past my headlight throw. I want to be fair to myself here, because a shadow off a security light can do strange things. It can stretch, it can bend around a curve, I know that. But I also know what a stretched coyote shadow looks like, because I've seen plenty on plenty of nights, and it does not have shoulders. I shut the curtain. I turned the CB on low, more for the company of voices than for any real reason, and I sat there with my hand actually resting on the door lock, like locking a truck door has ever stopped anything that wanted in badly enough. The third turn is the one that changed what kind of story this was, at least for me, lying there. It stopped circling. I want you to sit with that the way I had to. For a while, the pacing had been a comfort in its own sick way, because pacing means it's moving past you, not toward you. Then it stopped, right around the passenger door, and I heard the mirror housing creak. Not blow in the wind. We didn't have wind that night. I checked the weather report before I even parked. Creak, like weight pressed against it and let go. Then a scrape along the bottom of the sleeper, slow, like something was testing the seam where the door meets the frame. Dogs sniff. Coyotes bolt. This was patient in a way that didn't match any animal I've ever shared a lot with, and somewhere in there my gallows humor ran dry for about 20 straight minutes, which for me is basically a geological era. By sunrise, I hadn't slept more than an hour in pieces, and I did what I always do when I'm rattled, which is get out and look at things in daylight, because daylight fixes most of what dark makes ugly. It didn't fix this one. Out past where I'd parked, in the softer gravel near the fence line, there were prints. 4 of them, clear enough to matter, and they were wrong in a way I felt before I could explain it. Wide, deep, with a stride between them that I paced out myself, heel to heel, and it came out longer than my own walking stride, and I'm 6'1". Coyote prints run close together in a line because they're small animals moving efficiently. These weren't close together. They were spaced like something big had covered ground without hurrying. That's the 4th turn, and it's the one where I actually said something to a person instead of just to myself. I flagged down the lot attendant, a guy in a reflective vest doing his morning walk of the pumps, and I pointed at the prints and asked him straight out what made those. He barely glanced down before he said, "Big coyote, maybe a bobcat. They get large out here." I said the spacing's wrong for that, and he did something I noticed even half asleep. He looked at the prints again, actually looked this time, and something moved through his face that wasn't boredom anymore. Then he said it again, coyote, but quieter, like he was convincing himself instead of me, and he didn't walk any closer to that fence line to check. He found a reason to be needed at the pumps instead. I didn't push it that morning. I got my part. I got the truck running, and I told myself the story would end there. Another weird night on the road, to bring up at a truck stop counter someday. It didn't end there, and that's the 5th turn, because curiosity is a hard habit to break once something's cracked it open. A couple weeks later, sitting in a different lot a few states over, bored on a long wait, I looked up the area, not looking for anything specific, just Kingman, that stretch of I-40, animal sightings, the kind of search you do half as a joke to prove yourself wrong. I found a rancher's post from a few months earlier about losing stock near that same stretch. Animals found without a mark of a struggle around them, which the county blamed on mountain lions. Standard answer. Probably the right one most of the time. But under that post were a couple of comments from other drivers, the kind with handles instead of names, describing almost exactly what I'd heard. Pacing. A creak at the mirror. One guy said he stopped running nights through Kingman altogether, and wouldn't say why on a public board, just that people should ask other drivers, not the internet. So I asked another driver. That's the 6th turn, and it's the one that stuck with me longest, because it wasn't a stranger on a screen. It was a guy I actually trust, an older hauler named Rulon who's run that corridor for 20-some years. I brought it up half-joking over the radio one night just to see his reaction, and he didn't laugh. He went quiet for a second, then told me, off the record, the way you tell someone something you don't want, repeated back to you, that there's a short list of stops along that stretch. Drivers just don't overnight at anymore, if they can help it, and that lot's on it. He said the stops themselves will never confirm it, because a story like that is bad for business. Easier to blame coyotes, and keep the lights buzzing and the pumps running, and most nights nothing happens anyway, so why would they change a thing? He said it the way you'd talk about a bad stretch of road with no guardrail. Not the way you'd talk about a ghost story. That's what made it worse. It wasn't spooky to him. It was just a known cost of doing the job that nobody puts in writing. I might have let it settle into that, filed away as an unsettling fact of the road, if it hadn't been for the seventh thing, the one I only found by accident, going through old dashcam footage for an unrelated insurance claim months later. My rig runs a side camera on the passenger mirror, motion triggered, mostly for catching lot lizards and cargo thieves, and I'd honestly forgotten it was even active that night. 99% of the clips it saves are nothing, a moth, a gust of trash blowing past. I almost skipped right over the one time-stamped 1:47 a.m. from that Kingman lot. It's less than a second long. There's motion, a shape at the edge of the frame, catching the porch light spill off the fuel island. Tall, upright, gone again, before the frame settles. I watched it maybe 30 times before I let myself see the part that actually matters, which is that in that fraction of a second, it isn't facing the truck, generally the way an animal drawn by a smell would be. Its face, if that's even the word, is turned dead level at the lens. Not the cab, not the door, the camera. I haven't shown many people that clip. The ones I have shown go quiet the same way Rulon did. I still run that stretch of I-40, because it's the job, and the job doesn't care what you're scared of. When I break down, which happens, because trucks break down, I take the tow into town, instead of waiting in a lot if there's any way around it. And if there isn't, I park under the brightest lights I can find, and I leave the CB on all night, and I do not crack that curtain, not even an inch, not for a look, not for anything. I still tell the story with the joke on top, because the joke is easier for people to sit with over coffee than the fact underneath it, which is that something out there paced my truck for hours, with a patience no hungry animal has ever shown me, and when I finally had proof of it on camera, it wasn't looking for food. It was looking to see if I was watching back. We fuel up west of Kingman most Tuesdays. Same stretch of I-40 out past Golden Valley, where the desert opens up and there's nothing but scrub and power lines, and the kind of silence that makes the diesel pumps sound loud. It was March. Cold enough in the morning that our breath still showed a little, and Denny was topping off the reefer unit while I went in for coffee and to log our hours before the sun got high enough to cook the cab. That's when I saw her. Young, maybe 19, 20 at the outside, standing at the pump 2 down from ours, in a t-shirt that wasn't built for the weather. Arms wrapped around herself, not for warmth, but like she was holding something in. She wasn't looking at the pump numbers, or the road, or the mountains. She was watching the man next to her, the way you watch someone when you're waiting to find out if you did something wrong. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it's not the part people expect. I didn't feel my stomach drop or my hair stand up. I felt annoyed. I'd sat through the trafficking awareness module our carrier makes every driver do once a year, the one with the actors and the checklist, and some tired, cynical part of me thought, here we go. Every girl having a bad morning with her boyfriend is not a federal case. Denny would have said the same thing if I'd said it out loud. We'd both seen enough real fights at truck stops, enough slammed doors and crying in gas station bathrooms, to know that most of it is just people being miserable to each other in public because they don't know how to do it anywhere else. So I grabbed my coffee, and I almost let it go. Then, the man pointed at pump 6, told her to move the car forward, and she flinched. Not a wince, not an eye roll. Her whole body pulled back, like the finger itself was going to land on her. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't raised his hand past his hip. And that's the part from the training that came back to me clean and specific. The line I'd rolled my eyes at a year earlier. Watch for a reaction that doesn't match the size of the gesture. A flinch that big doesn't come from a bad morning. It comes from a body that's been taught, over and over, exactly what comes next. I went inside anyway, told myself I was still just getting coffee, and the girl behind the register was already looking past me at the same 2 pumps. She didn't say anything to me. She didn't have to. She rang me up with her jaw tight and her eyes flicking twice toward the window, and when I followed her look, I understood we weren't the only ones clocking it, and this probably wasn't the first time this particular corner of asphalt had seen something like it. Outside, the girl had come in to use the restroom, and the man walked with her as far as the hallway and stood there, arms crossed, close enough to hear the door, and I felt something in me tip all the way over from doubt into certainty. I've used plenty of gas station bathrooms with a boyfriend waiting by the ice machine. Nobody stands guard on a bathroom door like that unless they're making sure the person inside doesn't have 5 unsupervised minutes to think. I'll admit the next part wasn't smart. I wanted to say something to her. Not to him, to her. Some dumb instinct to catch her eye at the sink and ask if she was okay. I got as far as pushing the door open a few inches before Denny's hand landed on my shoulder from behind, and when I turned around, the man was already looking at us, flat and unblinking, the kind of look that isn't confused, just cataloging. He said, "Easy as anything, help you with something," and it wasn't a question. Denny said, "No, wrong door," and steered me back out into the lot, and my heart was going so hard, I could feel it in my teeth. That's the moment I understood the training wasn't wrong about the other half of it either. You don't confront, because whatever you set off, she's the one who pays for it after you've pulled back onto the interstate and forgotten your own license plate number, let alone hers. So we did the only thing we actually had control over. We walked to the truck, wrote down her plate before they pulled out. Texas tags, which needled at something, because we'd have bet money on Arizona or Nevada, and it meant whatever this was, it had already crossed at least one state line to get here. And Denny called the hotline while I sat in the cab and watched the pumps like it mattered, like watching could do anything. The call itself wasn't what I expected. No sirens in the background, no urgency in the operator's voice, just a woman running through a list of questions in the same tone you'd use to take a pizza order. Plate number, vehicle description, direction of travel, physical description of both parties, any visible injuries. When Denny mentioned the flinch and the bathroom door, she didn't gasp or thank us, like we'd done something heroic. She just said that was helpful, and asked us not to follow the vehicle when it left. That instruction stuck with me longer than anything else that day. Do not follow. Like they already knew exactly what kind of person calls in a tip like this and then can't let it go, can't stop themselves from trying to be the hero of somebody else's worst day. They pulled out a few minutes later, headed west, same direction we were going, and for about 40 miles, Denny and I didn't say much of anything, just watched every white pickup that passed, like it might be them, knowing full well it never would be, knowing we'd already done the only useful thing we were capable of doing. I wish I could tell you what happened to her. I can't. Nobody calls you back and tells you a tip led somewhere. Not usually. Not for privacy reasons that make sense even when they gut you. 6 months later, we did get a call, out of nowhere, from a detective's office in New Mexico. A polite 10-minute conversation, confirming the date and location and plate number for what they only called an active case file. No name, no outcome, nothing we could hang a story on. It was enough to know the plate hadn't gone nowhere. It wasn't enough to sleep easy over. And here's the part that actually changed how I run this stretch of highway for good. Almost a year later, same corridor, different truck stop 20 miles up the road, I saw the same man. Older now around the eyes, same flat cataloging look, gassing up a different vehicle with a different girl, standing exactly the same distance from him, arms wrapped around herself the same way. I don't know if our call ever put a scratch on him. I don't know if the case went anywhere or died in a drawer. What I know is he was still out there working the same road, and that the tip we gave, however good it felt in the moment, hadn't been the ending I'd let myself believe it was. I never told Denny why I can't drive past a fuel stop without doing the scan anymore. Eyes on hands, eyes on shoes, eyes on who's standing too close to a bathroom door. My younger sister ran off with a man twice her age when she was 17, and for 4 months our family didn't know if she was alive. And when she came home, she wasn't the same person, and she's never once told us what those months were. Nobody put her on a milk carton. Nobody made a movie about it. She just came back different, and eventually stopped coming back at all. And I think about her every single time I see a girl, standing too still next to a man who isn't touching her, but doesn't need to. We made that second call too, and the one after that. And I expect we'll make another one before we're done driving this route. Because the truth nobody tells you about doing the right thing out here is that it doesn't close the case. It doesn't give you the ending. It just gives you one more thing you carry down the interstate, with everything else in the cab. We've never once regretted making the call. We've just stopped expecting it to feel like enough. Every dispatcher who's worked the graveyard board long enough gets asked about the Topak call eventually, and we all give pretty much the same answer. We say we don't like talking about it. Then we talk about it anyway, because once you've sat with that tape, it doesn't really let go of you, and telling it again is sometimes the only way to put it down for a night. I'd been on the desk about 6 years when it happened, which by our turnover is basically senior staff. The driver was a guy named Warren Doyle, 41 years old, ran for a mid-size reefer outfit out of Oklahoma City, and I'd talked to him probably 300 times before that night without ever meeting him in person. That's normal. You know a voice. You know a cadence. You know how a guy sounds when he's tired versus when he's just bored. And Warren was steady, not chatty, not short with you, just a guy doing 11 hours and wanting to get to the next scale on time so he could log his break and eat something that wasn't out of a gas station. He was running westbound on 40, coming up on the river crossing at Topak, right where the interstate hands off from Arizona into California, that long flat bridge over the Colorado with nothing around it but rock and water, and the old railroad bridge sitting next to it like a leftover. It's routine mileage. Drivers cross it a few hundred times a day, and nobody thinks about it, because there's nothing to think about. Empty land on both sides, a scale house waiting on the California side, and that's it. He keyed up right on schedule to give me his ETA into the scale, and it was a completely normal transmission for maybe 20 seconds. Then he paused in a way that wasn't like him, and said there was something pacing him. I asked him to repeat that, thinking he meant another truck running alongside him, maybe someone trying to pass on a bridge that doesn't really allow for it. He said no. That's what he thought too at first. But it wasn't a truck. He said it was staying level with him in his driver's side mirror, not gaining, not falling back, just matching him exactly. And he said it in this flat, confused voice, like a man trying to explain something to himself out loud so it would make sense. Then he said, "It's not," and the transmission cut. Not garbled, not staticky, just gone, mid-word, like someone had let off the button. I called back 3 times. Nothing. I had him on GPS ping, still moving, still on the bridge, still at highway speed, so my first read was a radio failure, which happens. Antenna wire, bad connector, nothing dramatic. I logged the time and kept working the board, because that's the job. You don't stop everything for one quiet channel. About 4 minutes later, his unit registered stationary at the scale house lot, on the California side, engine still running, which told me he'd made the crossing fine and just pulled in like normal. I figured he'd fixed his radio or forgotten to key back up, and I moved on to the next call. It was the scale house attendant who called it in, not us, about 20 minutes after that, saying the truck had been sitting there running with no driver anywhere near it, and nobody had seen him get out. When DPS got there, everything about that truck was correct. Not abandoned correct, parked correct. Wheels chalked wasn't required there, but the brake was properly set. Transmission in neutral, engine idling clean. No warning lights, nothing knocked over in the cab. His logbook was closed out for the day, like he intended to stop right there. Sunglasses on the dash, phone on the seat, locked. No missed calls, no messages sent. Wallet in his jacket on the hook behind the seat. The only thing wrong with that scene was that Warren wasn't in it, and there was no footpath, no drag marks, no blood, no sign at all that a person had ever gotten out of that cab in any hurry or any struggle. The dash cam, when they pulled it, showed exactly what it should. Bridge, water, his own hands on the wheel until the frame where he isn't in frame anymore, because the camera was aimed at the road, not at him, so it never actually caught him leaving. 1 second you can hear him on the recording, and by the next logged frame, the cab's just quiet. For a while, the working theory inside our office, the one that let people sleep, was that Warren had some kind of episode, fatigue psychosis, a stroke, something that made him panic and bail out on a moving truck, and that the truck had somehow rolled itself into a parking pattern before drifting to a stop, and that his body was somewhere in the river we just hadn't found yet. That version of events is sad, but it's normal. Rivers keep things. Except I ran trucks myself for 4 years before I ever sat a headset, and I could not make that story work, because a transmission in neutral with a properly set parking brake is not something the truck does on its own when a man panics and jumps. Somebody, or something, finished parking that truck the way Warren would have parked it if nothing at all was wrong. That's the part I couldn't let go of. Whatever happened to him didn't happen, and then leave a mess behind. It happened, and then it cleaned up after itself. I didn't do anything with that thought for almost 2 years. I told myself it wasn't my case anymore, once DPS and the company's insurance people took it over, and there wasn't a file left open on our end to justify digging further. But dispatchers keep their own kind of archive, the stuff that isn't official. Old recorded channels going back on server tape long past when anyone's supposed to need them. And one slow night I started pulling anything I could find with Topak in the location tag, mostly out of habit, the way you pick at something that never healed right. What I found wasn't one call. It was 5, going back to 1994, all logged at that same bridge, all with a driver saying almost the exact same sentence before going dead air, and all ending with a truck parked correctly, somewhere it had no clear reason to stop. Engine running, driver gone, nothing ever recovered from the river, despite full searches every time. Different companies, different drivers, different decades, same bridge, same handful of words, close enough to the letter that it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like something being repeated back through whoever happened to be holding the mic that night. It wasn't a bridge with one bad story. It was a bridge that produced the same story on a cycle, quietly enough that nobody upstream had ever connected the dots, because each one got closed out separately, in a different year, by a different desk, as a tragic, isolated disappearance. I went back to the earliest one I could find a physical reel for, from 1994, mostly because I wanted to hear if the driver on that tape sounded as calm as Warren had, right up until he wasn't. He did. And the dispatcher answering him back sounded calm too, right up until the driver went quiet, and then she said his name once, gently, the way you'd try to bring somebody back from somewhere without startling them. I know that voice. I've heard it every day, for years, in meetings, on hold messages, in my own head when I'm tired, and arguing with myself on the drive home. It's mine. Same flat delivery, same little catch on the second syllable of a name, when I'm trying not to sound scared. I wasn't born yet when that tape was recorded, and there is no version of this where that's actually possible, and I have listened to it enough times now that I've stopped trying to explain it and started just accepting that it's true, whatever it means. I never put any of that in a report. What would I even write? There's nothing about a voice match with no explanation that helps a family, nothing that changes a closed file, nothing that brings Warren Doyle back to whoever was waiting on him at home. So I kept it. I still work that board. I still take crossings at Topak every single shift, without asking to, because asking to be moved off it would mean explaining why, and I don't have an explanation, just a pattern I can't unsee anymore, which is that every one of those calls, decades apart, happened while someone with my exact voice was the one listening, not a different girl each time, who happened to sound like me, however that works. So I keep doing the job the way I've always done it, calm, steady, giving drivers their mile markers and their ETAs, and somewhere under all of that, every single night, I'm listening for one specific sentence I already know by heart, because I think when it finally comes through on my line again, it isn't going to be about whoever's driving.